The train lurched to a stop with a metallic shriek that made Clara's teeth ache. She pressed her gloved hand against the window, smudging the glass as she stared out at what would become her prison. Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. 1878. The platform wasn't really a platform, just a stretch of sun-bleached planks that looked like they'd collapse under a strong wind. Beyond it, the town sprawled low and defeated across the prairie, buildings the color of dust and disappointment. The sky stretched overhead in a blue so violent it hurt to look at, nothing like the soft gray canopy she'd known in Boston. Everything here felt exposed, vulnerable. Clara had been on this train for 6 days. 6 days of rattling wheels and stale bread, and the constant, suffocating knowledge that her father had finally won. She could still hear his voice from that last morning in their Beacon Hill townhouse, cold and final as a judge, delivering sentence. "You've embarrassed me for the last time, refused every suitable match I've arranged. You think you're too good for the men I've chosen? Fine. Let's see how you fare with a frontier rancher who needs a wife more than he needs your opinions." 20 years old, and she'd been sold like livestock. The other passengers were already pushing toward the exit, eager to escape the close air of the train car. Clara didn't move. Her traveling companion, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd talked nonstop since Ohio, was gathering her parcels with the efficiency of someone who'd made this journey a dozen times. "You'll do fine, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, not unkindly. "The frontier breaks some women, that's true enough, but it makes others into something stronger than they ever imagined. You just have to decide which kind you'll be." Clara wanted to tell her that she hadn't been given a choice in any of this, but Mrs. Patterson was already shuffling toward the door, leaving behind only the faint smell of lavender water and mothballs. The car emptied. Clara remained in her seat. Through the window, she could see men in dusty clothes moving along the platform. Ranch hands, probably. Hired guns? The kind of rough characters her father had always warned her about while simultaneously ensuring she'd never have to meet one. Until now. "Ma'am?" The conductor appeared at her elbow, an older man with kind eyes that had seen too many reluctant brides arrive on this train. "This is your stop, Red Hollow. I know where I am. Your husband sent word he'd be here to collect you." Husband. The word tasted like ashes. She'd never met Elias Mercer. Didn't know if he was 30 or 60, scarred or handsome, cruel or merely indifferent. Her father had handled all the arrangements through letters and telegrams, negotiating her future like a business transaction, which, she supposed, was exactly what it was. Mercer needed a wife. Her father needed her gone. Problem solved. Clara stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her traveling dress, dark green wool that was already too heavy for this climate. Her trunks had been unloaded earlier. Everything she owned was sitting on that platform, waiting for a stranger to claim it, waiting for him to claim her. She stepped down onto the platform and the heat hit her like a physical blow. It was only May, but the sun hammered down with an intensity Boston had never prepared her for. Within seconds, sweat beaded at her temples. Her corset felt like an iron cage. "Mrs. Mercer?" The voice came from her left. Clara turned. The man standing there wasn't what she'd expected. He was younger than she'd feared, perhaps 30, tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living. His face was weathered, carved into sharp angles by sun and wind, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a dark shirt, dusty trousers, boots that had seen better days, and a gun belt that looked entirely too comfortable around his hips. Not handsome, exactly, but striking in a way that made her breath catch. He held his hat in his hands, and something about that small gesture of respect threw her off balance. "I'm Elias Mercer," he said. His voice was deep, rough-edged, like gravel under wagon wheels. "I'm sorry I'm late. Had some trouble with a broke fence line up on the North Range." Clara had prepared herself for this moment during the long train ride. She'd practiced cold civility, rehearsed cutting remarks designed to establish that she might be forced into this marriage, but she would never be broken by it. Instead, she heard herself say, "I didn't expect you to be here at all." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of a fellow prisoner in this arrangement. "Your father sent a letter saying when you'd arrive. Seemed like I should be here to meet you." "How considerate." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. He didn't flinch. "Your trunks are in the wagon. If you're ready, the ranch is about an hour's ride from town." "I'm not ready, but I don't suppose that matters." This time his eyes narrowed slightly. Mrs. Mercer, Miss Whitmore. She lifted her chin. I haven't agreed to anything yet. You got on the train? I was put on the train? They stared at each other across 3 feet of sun-baked platform. Around them, Red Hollow went about its business. The general store, the saloon, the livery stable, all conducting the mundane commerce of frontier life. No one paid them any attention. This scene had probably played out 100 times before. Elias Mercer put his hat back on, shadowing his eyes. Miss Whitmore, then, I understand this isn't what you wanted. It's not exactly what I wanted either. But we both got dealt into this hand, and the cards are on the table. I own a ranch 20 miles from here. It's a hard life out there, harder than anything you're used to. I need a wife who can handle that. Your father said you were educated, capable, and had enough grit to survive out here. My father would say anything to get rid of me. Maybe so. But you're here now, and I'm offering you a choice. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Come out to Red Hollow Ranch. See what the life looks like. If after a week you want to get back on that train and return to Boston, I'll buy your ticket myself. No questions asked. Clara blinked. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected any kind of choice at all. Why would you do that? Because I don't want a wife who's here against her will. Ranch life is brutal enough without adding misery to it. He gestured toward a wagon at the end of the platform. 1 week, Miss Whitmore. That's all I'm asking. Then you decide. She should refuse. Should demand he take her back to the train station immediately and book her passage home. But the thought of returning to Boston, to her father's house, to the suffocating round of social obligations and strategic marriages made her stomach turn. And there was something in Mercer's eyes that wasn't cruelty. Something that looked almost like understanding. 1 week, she said. He nodded and turned toward the wagon. Clara followed, acutely aware that every person on the platform was watching the Iron Rider of Red Hollow collect his mail-order bride. She'd heard the whispers while she waited on the train, other passengers talking about Mercer like he was some kind of legend. Or warning. The wagon was sturdy, but worn, pulled by 2 horses that looked more reliable than beautiful. Her trunks were already loaded in the back. Elias offered his hand to help her up onto the seat, and Clara hesitated just a moment before taking it. His hand was calloused, warm through her glove. He released her the moment she was settled. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon lurched forward, carrying Clara away from the last outpost of civilization and into the vast, unknowable wilderness beyond. They rode in silence through Red Hollow's single street. The town was smaller than Clara had imagined, a handful of buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and left to weather as best they could. A few women in faded dresses watched from doorways. Men tipped their hats as the wagon passed, but their eyes followed Clara with undisguised curiosity. The new Mrs. Mercer, another Eastern girl come west to see if she'd survive. Once they left town, the landscape opened up into rolling grassland that stretched to every horizon. The sky was bigger than Clara had ever imagined sky could be, enormous and empty and so blue it looked artificial. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the western horizon. Is it always this? Clara searched for the word. Empty? Elias supplied. Exposed. You get used to it. Most people who come from back east find the space overwhelming at first. Makes them feel small. It doesn't make you feel small? I grew up out here. This is just how the world looks to me. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. He drove with easy competence, his hands steady on the reins, his attention moving constantly across the landscape like he was reading a language she didn't understand. Every few minutes his gaze would sweep the horizon, checking for something she couldn't see. What are you looking for? She asked. Trouble. It comes in a lot of different forms out here. Such as? Storms, rustlers, wild horses that'll spook the team if they get too close, riders from the Crow outfit. Who's Crow? Elias's jaw tightened. Silas Crow. Owns the biggest ranch in the territory, or thinks he does. He's been buying up land for years, pushing out the smaller ranchers. Anyone who doesn't sell gets squeezed until they break. And you won't sell? Red Hollow has something Crow wants more than the land itself. Water rights to the eastern fork of the Red River. Control that water and you control every ranch in the valley. He's been trying to take it from me for 5 years. Clara absorbed this information, filing it away. Is he dangerous? Very. Then why not just sell? Take the money and start over somewhere else. Elias turned to look at her for the first time since they'd left town. His eyes were hard. Because Red Hollow is mine. I built it from nothing, and I'm not handing it over to a land-grabbing tyrant just because the fight is hard. You don't survive out here by running every time someone threatens you. There was steel in his voice. The same steel Clara had heard in her father's voice when he was talking about business rivals. Men and their territories, she thought, their endless need to prove dominance over other men. But she kept that observation to herself. They rode in silence for another 30 minutes, following a rutted track that barely qualified as a road. The grass whispered in the wind, a sound Clara found both peaceful and unsettling. There was nothing else. No birdsong, no distant traffic, no church bells marking the hour. Just wind and grass and the creak of wagon wheels. Finally, Elias pointed ahead. Red Hollow. Clara followed his gaze and saw buildings rising from the prairie like they'd grown there naturally. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories, built from timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, a massive barn, several smaller structures she couldn't identify, corrals made from rough-hewn posts and rails. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing across the grassland, hundreds of them spread out in small groups. It looked substantial, permanent, like someone had carved out a piece of civilization from the wilderness and was determined to defend it. As they approached, ranch hands appeared from various directions, stopping their work to watch the wagon roll in. Clara counted at least 8 men, all of them weathered and armed, all of them studying her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism. She lifted her chin and stared back. A woman emerged from the main house as Elias pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch. She was perhaps 50, gray-haired and sturdy-looking, with the kind of face that had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. Her dress was practical calico, her apron stained with what looked like bread flour. "This is Mrs. Brennan," Elias said, climbing down from the wagon. "She runs the household, cooking, cleaning, managing supplies. Anything you need, she can help." Mrs. Brennan's eyes swept over Clara with the efficiency of a general inspecting troops. Clara had the distinct impression she was being evaluated and found wanting. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice as dry as the prairie wind, "welcome to Red Hollow. I've prepared the guest room for you." Guest room, not the master bedroom then. Clara wasn't sure if she was relieved or insulted. Elias was already unloading her trunks with the help of 2 ranch hands. He hauled the first one onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing and carried it toward the house. "Mrs. Brennan will show you where everything is. Supper's at 6. We eat in the main hall with the men." "With the men?" Clara repeated. "This is a working ranch, Miss Whitmore. We all eat together." He disappeared into the house before she could respond. The ranch hands finished unloading her belongings and drifted away, back to whatever work had been interrupted by her arrival. Within moments, Clara was standing alone on the porch with Mrs. Brennan, feeling like she'd been deposited on the doorstep and already forgotten. "Well," Mrs. Brennan said, not unkindly, "let's get you settled. I imagine you'll want to wash up after that journey." Clara followed her into the house, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior. The main room was large and functional, rough timber walls, a massive stone fireplace that could probably burn entire logs, furniture that looked hand-built but sturdy. Everything was clean but worn, practical rather than decorative. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no paintings on the walls. It looked like a place where people worked too hard to worry about comfort. Mrs. Brennan led her up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. The guest room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the ranch yard. Clara's trunks had already been deposited against one wall. "Water's in the pitcher," Mrs. Brennan said. "Chamber pot's under the bed. Privy's out back if you need it, but I wouldn't recommend going out there after dark without someone to escort you. Rattlesnakes come out at night." "Rattlesnakes," Clara repeated faintly. "Among other things. This is the frontier, Miss Whitmore. It's not Boston." There was something almost challenging in the older woman's tone, like she was testing to see if this Eastern girl would faint at the first mention of danger. Clara met her eyes steadily. "I'm aware of where I am, Mrs. Brennan. Thank you for the warning." The housekeeper nodded, her expression unreadable. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late. Mr. Mercer runs this ranch on a schedule, and he expects everyone to keep to it." She left, closing the door behind her with a firm click. Clara stood alone in the small room, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere below, she could hear men's voices. The thump of boots on wooden floors. The general noise of a place that never quite stopped moving. She walked to the window and looked out at Red Hollow Ranch spreading before her. The sun was lowering toward the western mountains, painting the grassland gold and orange. In the corrals, horses moved restlessly. The cattle had begun their evening drift toward water. Ranch hands were finishing their day's work, leading horses to the barn, repairing fence sections, hauling equipment into storage. It was a world completely foreign to everything Clara had ever known, and she was going to have to survive it for at least a week. She unpacked mechanically, hanging her dresses in the tiny closet, arranging her brushes and hairpins on the washstand, storing her books at the bottom of one trunk because there was nowhere else to put them. Everything she owned looked ridiculous here. The silk gowns that would be destroyed by dust and wind, the delicate shoes that wouldn't last a day on rough terrain, the parasol that seemed like something from a stage play about genteel life. She'd brought the wrong life to the wrong place. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, Clara had washed the train dust from her face and changed into a simple day dress that was the most practical thing she owned. It was still too formal for a ranch, but it would have to do. She braided her dark hair into a simple plait and pinned it up, then descended the stairs toward the sound of men's voices. The main hall was actually the dining room, dominated by a long, rough-hewn table that could seat 20 people. Tonight, about a dozen men were already seated, plates filled with beef, beans, and cornbread. The conversation died the moment Clara appeared in the doorway. Elias stood at the head of the table. "Miss Whitmore, there's a seat here." He indicated the chair to his right. Clara walked the length of that table, feeling every eye track her movement, sat down with as much dignity as she could manage, and accepted the plate Mrs. Brennan placed in front of her. "Gentlemen," Elias said, his voice cutting through the awkward silence, "this is Miss Clara Whitmore. She'll be staying with us for a time. I expect everyone to treat her with respect." A chorus of "yes, sir," and "ma'am" rippled around the table. Elias continued around the table, introducing each man. Charlie, the foreman, an older man with a scarred face and kind eyes. Dutch, who handled the horses. Tommy and James, who were brothers and worked the cattle. Others whose names blurred together in Clara's exhausted mind. They ate. The food was simple but good, and Clara realized she was starving. She hadn't eaten properly since Ohio. The cornbread was slightly burned at the edges, but warm, and the beef was tougher than anything served at her father's table, but seasoned with something that made her reach for a second helping. The men gradually resumed their conversation, though they kept their voices lower and their language cleaner than she suspected was normal. They talked about cattle, about fence repairs needed on the western range, about a water source that was drying up faster than expected. "We need rain," Charlie said, shaking his head. "Another month like this, and we'll be in real trouble." "Rain will come," Elias said, but he didn't sound convinced. "And if it doesn't, then we make do with what we have, same as always." Clara listened, beginning to understand that Red Hollow existed in a state of constant crisis management. Water, weather, repairs, threats from Silas Crow, every day brought new problems that had to be solved or endured. After supper, the men drifted away to their bunks or their evening chores. Clara helped Mrs. Brennan clear the table, ignoring the older woman's raised eyebrows at this unexpected assistance. "You don't need to do that, Miss Whitmore." "I need to do something." Mrs. Brennan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Well then, you can help with the washing up." They worked in silence, falling into an efficient rhythm. Through the window, Clara could see Elias standing in the ranch yard with Charlie, the two men talking in low voices while the sun set behind them. Elias's posture was tense, his hand resting unconsciously on his gun belt. "He's a good man," Mrs. Brennan said, following Clara's gaze. "Hard, but fair. He built this place from nothing after his parents died. Was only 17 when he took over. Most people thought he'd fail within a year. Silas Crow certainly thought so. But he didn't fail. No, he got meaner and tougher and smarter than anyone expected. Held on to every inch of this land no matter what Crow threw at him. The ranch hands here would die for him. Some nearly have." Clara absorbed this information. Why did he agree to this arrangement, taking a wife he's never met? Mrs. Brennan was quiet for so long that Clara thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, the older woman said, "Because running a ranch this size alone is killing him. He needs help, even if he's too stubborn to admit it. A partner, someone who can handle the parts of this operation he doesn't have time for. He needs a business manager, not a wife." Maybe, but out here, those are usually the same thing. Mrs. Brennan dried the last plate and hung the towel to dry. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone softer, someone who would take one look at this place and start crying for her mother." "I haven't spoken to my mother in 2 years." Mrs. Brennan's expression shifted slightly. "Well then, maybe you'll last longer than I thought." She left Clara standing in the kitchen, watching through the window as darkness settled over Red Hollow Ranch. One by one, lamps were lit in the bunkhouse. Stars began to emerge overhead, more stars than Clara had ever seen, scattered across the black sky like someone had spilled a barrel of diamonds. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Elias in the doorway. "I'll show you the ranch tomorrow," he said. "Give you a sense of what life here looks like. Then you can make your decision. About staying, about whether this is something you can live with." Clara looked at this man who was supposed to be her husband. He stood in the shadows of his own home, weathered and guarded, carrying the weight of this entire operation on his shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Earlier, on the platform, you said this arrangement wasn't what you wanted either. What did you want?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted to build something that lasts. A ranch that could survive anything the frontier throws at it. I wanted to prove that a man doesn't need money or connections or a famous name to make a mark on this world. He just needs to be willing to work hard enough and fight long enough to earn it. And a wife wasn't part of the original plan. But I'm 30 years old and running this place alone is—" He trailed off, seeming to search for words. "Lonely, and I'm tired of being alone." The honesty in his voice caught Clara off guard. She'd expected many things from this man: coldness, demands, indifference. She hadn't expected vulnerability. "I'm tired of being alone too," she admitted. Something passed between them in the darkness. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. Two people who'd been backed into corners by circumstances beyond their control, trying to figure out if they could make something workable from the wreckage of their plans. "Get some rest, Miss Whitmore," Elias said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He left, and Clara climbed the stairs to her small room. She undressed slowly, folding her clothes with mechanical precision, then lay down on the narrow bed in her shift. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night, horses moving in the corrals, men's voices drifting from the bunkhouse, wind sighing through the grass. And beneath it all, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Clara closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but every time she began to drift off, she jolted awake again, disoriented by the darkness and the strangeness of this place. She'd agreed to 1 week, 7 days to decide if she could build a life in this harsh, beautiful, impossible land. It seemed like both an eternity and nowhere near enough time. Tits. The rooster woke Clara before dawn with a sound like someone was murdering a trumpet. She jerked upright in bed, heart pounding, before remembering where she was. Red Hollow Ranch, Wyoming territory. Her new life, or at least her temporary one. She dressed quickly in the dark, choosing the most practical outfit she owned, a simple brown dress with none of the elaborate trim that marked her other clothes as belonging to a different world. The house was quiet, except for sounds from the kitchen below. Clara made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Brennan already working at the massive cast-iron stove, preparing breakfast for the ranch hands. "You're up early," the housekeeper said. "I couldn't sleep." "That'll pass. Or it won't, and you'll leave. Either way, might as well make yourself useful. Can you cook?" Clara thought about the elaborate French dishes her mother's cook had prepared in Boston, the delicate pastries and carefully constructed sauces. "Not the kind of cooking you do here." "Then you'll learn. Start with the coffee. Pot's there, water's in the barrel, grounds are in the tin. Make it strong. Men work hard. They need coffee that'll wake them up properly." Clara followed instructions, grateful to have a task that kept her hands busy. By the time the coffee was brewing, the kitchen smelled almost normal, almost welcoming. The ranch hands began filing in as the sky lightened from black to gray. They nodded to Clara with varying degrees of awkwardness. Grown men who spent their days wrestling cattle and mending fence suddenly reduced to tongue-tied boys by the presence of a woman at breakfast. Elias arrived last, looking like he'd already been awake for hours. Probably had been. His shirt was dusty, his hair damp like he'd just dunked his head in the water trough. "Miss Whitmore, some," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from her hands. "Sleep well?" "No." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "That's honest. Come on, let's get you fed, and then I'll show you the ranch." Breakfast was eggs, bacon, and more of Mrs. Brennan's cornbread. The men ate with single-minded efficiency, fueling up for a day of hard labor. Clara picked at her food, her stomach still adjusting to the heavy frontier diet. After breakfast, Elias led her outside into the cool morning air. The sun was just breaking over the eastern horizon, painting everything gold and pink. In the corrals, horses moved restlessly, their breath steaming in the chill. "Can you ride?" Elias asked. "Yes, though probably not the way you ride. We'll start with something gentle." He saddled 2 horses, a large bay gelding for himself, and a smaller mare for Clara. The mare had kind eyes and seemed unbothered by Clara's obvious nervousness. "Her name's Maple," Elias said, holding the mare steady while Clara mounted. "She's patient with beginners." "I'm not a beginner." "You're a beginner out here. Different kind of riding when you're not in a park with groomed paths." He was right, of course. Within 10 minutes of leaving the ranch yard, Clara understood just how different this kind of riding was. They followed rough trails through grassland that hid holes and rocks, forded a shallow creek that made Maple sidestep nervously, climbed a ridge that gave them a view of the entire valley. Elias pointed out the boundaries of Red Hollow land, miles and miles of grass and scrub, dotted with cattle that looked like toys in the distance. He showed her the water sources, the summer pastures, the line camps where men stayed during roundup season. "This is what we're fighting for," he said, gesturing at the landscape spread before them. "Crow wants to swallow all of this, add it to his empire. But this land, these water rights, they're the only thing keeping a dozen smaller ranchers afloat. If Red Hollow falls, the whole valley falls to Crow." Clara studied the vast emptiness, trying to understand what made men willing to kill for this. "How do you fight someone more powerful than you?" she asked. "By refusing to lose. By being meaner and smarter and more stubborn than he expects. By making him pay for every inch he tries to take." There was something almost frightening in his intensity. This wasn't just business to Elias Mercer. This was identity, purpose, the entire meaning of his existence distilled into holding on to this patch of earth. They rode for hours, until Clara's legs ached and sweat soaked through her dress despite the cool morning. Elias showed her everything, the breaking pens where young horses were trained, the branding corrals, the massive barn where hay was stored for winter feeding. He introduced her to more ranch hands whose names immediately fled from her memory. By the time they returned to the main house, the sun was high, and Clara was exhausted. "You did well," Elias said, helping her dismount. "Most Eastern women wouldn't have lasted 2 hours." "Don't congratulate me yet. I can barely walk." "That'll pass. You get used to saddle soreness." Mrs. Brennan had lunch ready, sandwiches and cold water drawn fresh from the well. Clara ate on the porch, watching the ranch continue its endless cycle of work. There was always something that needed doing, always another problem to solve. In the afternoon, Elias went back to work, and Clara was left to her own devices. She wandered through the ranch house, learning its geography. Besides her small guest room, there were 2 other bedrooms upstairs, one clearly Elias's, spare and utilitarian, and another that looked unused. Downstairs was the main hall, the kitchen, a small office crammed with ledgers and maps, and a sitting room that nobody seemed to use. She found herself drawn to the office. The ledgers were open on the desk, covered in neat columns of figures. Clara had always been good with numbers, one of the few skills her father had grudgingly acknowledged, and even a quick glance told her that Red Hollow's finances were precarious. Income barely exceeded expenses. One bad season would destroy them. "Do you always snoop through other people's private papers?" Clara spun around to find Elias in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't snooping. I was looking. That's usually what snooping is." "You're barely breaking even," Clara said, deciding offense was better than defense. One hard winter and you'll lose everything. I'm aware of the finances, thank you. Then why aren't you diversifying? All your income comes from cattle. If the market drops or disease hits the herd, this is a cattle ranch, Miss Whitmore. That's what we do. But you own water rights. You could charge other ranchers for access, create a revenue stream that isn't dependent on livestock prices. Elias's jaw tightened. I'm not going to extort my neighbors for water. It's not extortion. It's business. And it might be the difference between surviving and failing. I appreciate your input, but I've been running this ranch for 13 years without help from a Boston accountant. The words stung more than Clara expected. She turned back to the ledgers, keeping her voice level. Fine. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm sure your pride will be very comforting when Silas Crow forecloses on the property. She walked past him out of the office, back through the main hall, up the stairs to her small room. She didn't slam the door, but it was a near thing. Through her window, she watched Elias stride across the ranch yard toward the barn, his shoulders rigid with frustration. Mrs. Brennan appeared in her doorway a few minutes later. That went well. I don't want to talk about it. Men like Elias Mercer don't take advice easily, especially not from women, especially not from women they barely know. Then maybe he shouldn't have brought a stranger here and shown her his failing finances. Mrs. Brennan's lips twitched. Maybe not, but he did, which tells me something. What? That he needs help more than he wants to admit, and that you might be exactly the kind of help he needs, if you can both get past your own stubbornness long enough to work together. The housekeeper left, and Clara was alone with her anger and her racing thoughts. She'd been at Red Hollow for less than 24 hours, and already she'd managed to insult the man she was supposed to be considering as a husband. Not that it mattered. This arrangement would never work. Elias Mercer didn't want a partner. He wanted... what? She wasn't even sure anymore. That evening at supper, they sat at opposite ends of the long table and didn't speak. The ranch hands sensed the tension and kept their conversation muted. Even Mrs. Brennan seemed subdued. After the meal, Clara helped clean up in silence, then retreated to her room. She stood at her window watching the stars emerge, brilliant and cold and indifferent to the small dramas of human life unfolding below. A knock at her door startled her. Come in. Elias entered, still in his work clothes, looking uncomfortable in the small space. I owe you an apology. Clara waited. You were right, he continued. About the finances, about diversifying, about all of it. I've been so focused on just surviving day to day that I haven't thought strategically. And when you pointed that out, I got defensive because... He paused. Because I should have seen it myself. You've been busy keeping this place running. That's no excuse for stupidity. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Look, Miss Whitmore, I'm not good at this. Asking for help. Admitting when I'm wrong. But if you're willing to stay, even just for the week, I could use your help with the books. Your perspective. Someone who can see problems I'm too close to notice. Clara studied him in the lamplight. Pride was costing him something to say this. I'll look at the books, she said, but I want to be clear about something. If I'm going to help, I need you to actually listen to what I suggest, not just dismiss it because I'm a woman or because I'm from back east. Fair enough. And I want access to everything, all the ledgers, all the contracts, all the records. I can't give you good advice if you hide half the information. Agreed. They shook hands on it, his grip firm and calloused against her palm. After he left, Clara sat on her bed and tried to process what had just happened. She'd come to Wyoming expecting to be a decorative wife, expected to be seen and not heard, expected to fade into the background of someone else's life. Instead, she'd just negotiated herself into a business partnership. And for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt something that might have been hope. The rest of the week passed in a blur of activity. Clara spent her mornings riding out with Elias, learning the ranch's geography and operations. She spent her afternoons in the office, working through years of financial records and beginning to understand the complex ecosystem of Red Hollow's business. The picture that emerged was troubling. Elias was right that Silas Crow had been squeezing the smaller ranchers. Clara found evidence of land sales made under duress, water rights sold for pennies on the dollar, mysterious accidents that had bankrupted families who then had no choice but to sell to Crow at rock-bottom prices. Red Hollow had survived because Elias refused to sell at any price, but survival wasn't the same as thriving. On the fourth day, Clara presented Elias with a proposal. They sat in his office after supper, the ledgers spread between them. "You need to formalize the Water Alliance," she said. "Right now you're letting neighboring ranchers access your water out of goodwill. Make it official. Contracts, fees scaled to their size. Agreements that protect everyone's interests." "I told you, I'm not going to charge people for water." "You're not charging them. You're creating a cooperative where everyone contributes according to their means and everyone benefits. It protects them from Crow, and it generates revenue that stabilizes Red Hollow's finances." Elias studied the papers she'd prepared. "This is more complicated than I thought." "That's because it's not just about money. It's about creating a power structure that Crow can't break. United, the small ranchers have leverage. Divided, he picks them off one by one. And you think this will work?" "I think it's better than waiting for him to destroy you all separately." Elias was quiet for a long time, reading through Clara's proposal. Finally, he looked up at her. "Where did you learn to think like this?" "My father. He's a ruthless businessman. I spent my childhood watching him destroy competitors and build monopolies. I learned how power works. And now you're using those lessons to fight someone like your father." Clara smiled without humor. "Ironic, isn't it?" On the sixth day, riders approached Red Hollow. Clara was in the garden behind the house, a small plot where Mrs. Brennan grew vegetables, when she heard the shout from the lookout. "Riders coming in! 3 of them!" She dropped the basket of beans she'd been collecting and ran to the front of the house. Elias was already there, standing in the ranch yard with Charlie and several other hands. All of them were armed. 3 men rode through the gate, their horses well fed and groomed in a way that signaled wealth. The man in the center was perhaps 50, with silver hair and expensive clothes that looked ridiculous on the frontier. He sat his horse like a king surveying conquered territory. Silas Crow. Clara knew him instantly, though they'd never met. There was something in his bearing, an absolute certainty of his own power, that marked him as the kind of man who'd built an empire on other people's suffering. "Mercer," Crow said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Good to see you." "Crow." Elias's voice was flat. "You're on my property uninvited." "Just being neighborly. Heard you took yourself a wife. Thought I'd come by and offer my congratulations." His eyes found Clara on the porch. She felt his gaze like something physical, assessing and dismissive all at once. "Mrs. Mercer, I presume, Silas Crow, at your service." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "What a brave woman you must be, coming all this way to marry a man like Elias. I do hope he's treating you well." "Mr. Crow," Clara said, keeping her voice level, "I'm afraid you've wasted a trip. We're quite busy here." Of course. I won't keep you long. I actually came with a business proposition." He turned back to Elias. "I'm prepared to make you an offer for Red Hollow. Very generous terms. Enough money for you and your new bride to start fresh somewhere more civilized." "I'm not selling." "Come now, Mercer, be reasonable. This valley is changing. The small ranchers are dying out. In 5 years, maybe less, I'll own everything from the mountains to the river. You can sell now and leave with dignity, or you can fight and lose everything." "I'll take my chances with fighting." Crow's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "That's a dangerous choice, especially now that you have a wife to worry about. Wouldn't want anything to happen to her because of your stubbornness." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Elias took a step forward, his hand moving toward his gun. "You threaten her again, and we'll settle this right now." Charlie and the other ranch hands moved up beside him, forming a line of armed men. For a long moment, Clara thought violence was going to erupt right there in the ranch yard. Then Crow laughed, a sound without real humor. "Easy, boys. I'm just here to talk business. But think about my offer, Mercer. Think hard, because the longer you wait, the less generous my terms will become." He turned his horse and rode out with his men, taking his time, making it clear he wasn't afraid of anything Elias might do. After they were gone, Elias stood in the yard staring at the empty gate, his whole body rigid with barely contained fury. Clara walked down from the porch and stood beside him. "He's going to come after us, isn't he?" "Yes." "When?" "Soon. Probably sooner now that he knows I have something he thinks I care about." "Do you?" Clara asked. "Care about me?" Elias turned to look at her. Something in his expression made her breath catch. I'm starting to. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the house settle around her, thinking about Silas Crow's cold eyes and calculated threats. She'd come to Wyoming expecting to be miserable. Instead, she'd found something that felt almost like purpose. The work with the books, the Water Alliance proposal, even the simple satisfaction of learning to ride properly. All of it added up to something she'd never had in Boston, a sense that she mattered. Tomorrow was the 7th day, the day she was supposed to decide whether to stay or go. Clara already knew her answer. She just wasn't sure if she was brave enough to say it out loud. Clara woke on the 7th morning to the sound of raised voices downstairs. She dressed quickly and descended to find Elias in the main hall with Charlie and 2 other ranch hands she recognized as Tommy and James. A man she'd never seen before stood near the door, his clothes dusty and his face drawn with exhaustion. "When did this happen?" Elias was asking. "Last night. They hit the Morrison place around midnight. Burned the barn, scattered the livestock. Dan Morrison tried to fight back and they beat him near to death. His wife and kids barely made it out." "Did anyone see who it was?" "Crow's men. Dan's oldest boy recognized 2 of them from town." Elias's expression turned to stone. "How many ranchers has he hit this week?" "Morrison makes 3, and that's just the ones we know about." Clara stepped into the room, and all 4 men turned to look at her. She could see the calculation in their eyes, wondering how much they should say in front of a woman, especially one who was supposed to be making her decision about staying today. "Don't stop talking on my account," Claire said. "I want to know what's happening." Elias hesitated, then nodded. "Crow's escalating. He's been hitting the smaller ranches at night, burning property, killing livestock, terrorizing families, trying to drive them out before we can organize any kind of resistance." "The Water Alliance," Clara said. "He's heard about it, or figured it out. Either way, he knows that if the small ranchers band together, his leverage disappears. So he's moving fast to break them before they can unite." The messenger shifted uncomfortably. "Dan Morrison's wife wants to know if Red Hollow can take them in for a while. They got nowhere else to go." "Of course," Elias said immediately. "Send them here. We'll find room." After the messenger left, Clara poured herself coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "How many families are we talking about? If Crow keeps attacking, how many people will need shelter?" "Could be dozens," Charlie said. His scarred face was grim. "Most of these folks are barely surviving as it is. One bad hit, and they got nothing left." "Then we need to move faster on the Alliance. Get everyone organized before Crow can pick them off individually." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "You're still here." "What?" "It's the 7th day. You were supposed to decide whether to stay or go." Clara had almost forgotten. The week had passed in such a blur of activity that the deadline had snuck up on her. She looked at Elias standing in his own house, surrounded by the evidence of an escalating war, and realized that leaving now would feel like desertion. "I'm staying," she said. "For now, anyway." Something shifted in Elias's expression. Relief, maybe, or something deeper that he wasn't ready to name. "Then we need to talk about what that means, because if you stay, you'll be a target. Crow's already threatened you once." "I heard the threat. I'm not leaving because of it." "Clara." He stopped, seeming to realize it was the first time he'd used her given name. "This isn't a game. People are going to get hurt. Some might die. And Crow will go after anyone he thinks matters to me. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway. "If you're all done with your war council, breakfast is getting cold. And Miss Whitmore, there's a matter in the kitchen that needs your attention." Clara followed her, grateful for the interruption. In the kitchen, Mrs. Brennan turned to face her with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "You're staying, then?" "Yes." "Because of the work, the books, and the Alliance and all that?" Clara thought about lying, then decided against it. "Partly. And partly because leaving feels like giving up, and I've spent too much of my life letting other people make my decisions for me." Mrs. Brennan nodded slowly. "Well then, if you're staying, there are things you need to know, starting with the fact that the guest room won't do anymore. People will expect you to be sharing the master bedroom with Elias. Appearances matter out here, even on the frontier." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks. She hadn't thought about the practical implications of staying. This arrangement is still... I know what the arrangement is. But what people think matters more than the truth, especially when you're trying to build alliances. Small ranchers need to believe that Red Hollow is stable. A married couple living in separate rooms suggests otherwise. She was right, Clara realized. It was strategic thinking, the kind her father had drilled into her. Perception shaped reality in business and politics. If Clara and Elias wanted to present a united front against Crow, they needed to look united in every way. "I'll move my things this afternoon," Clara said. Mrs. Brennan's stern expression softened slightly. "He's a good man. Stubborn and proud, but good. And he won't push you into anything you're not ready for. I've known him since he was 17 years old, and for all his faults, he's never been cruel." "You sound like you're trying to convince me of something." "Maybe I am. Maybe I'm just tired of watching him carry this burden alone." The Morrison family arrived that afternoon. Dan Morrison, with his face swollen and bandaged, his wife Sarah pale and shaking, and 3 children who clung to their mother's skirts and stared at everything with frightened eyes. Clara helped Mrs. Brennan settle them into one of the spare bedrooms, brought them food, found clean clothes for the children. Sarah Morrison wouldn't stop crying. She sat on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face, while she tried to muffle the sound so her children wouldn't hear. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry. We had nowhere else to go." "You don't need to apologize," Clara said, sitting beside her. "You're safe here." "For how long? How long before Crow comes for this place, too?" Clara had no answer for that. Instead, she held Sarah's hand while the other woman wept, and tried not to think about how easily this could be her in a few weeks or months, how quickly everything could burn. That evening, Clara moved her belongings from the guest room to the master bedroom. It was larger than where she'd been staying, with a proper bed and a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. Elias's few possessions were arranged with military precision. Clothes hung neatly, boots lined up by the door, a single book on the nightstand that looked like it had been read dozens of times. She was unpacking her dresses when he appeared in the doorway. "I can sleep in the office," he said. "Or the bunkhouse with the men. Mrs. Brennan says appearances matter." "They do, but your comfort matters more." Clara turned to face him. "I'm not comfortable with any of this. Not the situation, not the threat from Crow, not the fact that people's lives are being destroyed while we try to figure out how to stop it. But if sharing this room helps convince people that Red Hollow is stable, then that's what we'll do." Elias studied her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected." "You've said that before." "I keep being surprised. Most women in your position would have been on the first train back to Boston. Most women in my position haven't spent their entire lives being told they were too stubborn for their own good." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Well, out here, stubbornness is a survival trait. You'll fit right in." They worked out a system. Elias would sleep on top of the covers, Clara beneath them. A line of pillows down the middle of the bed served as an unspoken boundary. It was awkward and uncomfortable, and nothing like what either of them had probably imagined when they'd agreed to this arrangement. But it worked. Over the next 2 weeks, 4 more families arrived at Red Hollow seeking shelter. The ranch house bulged with refugees. Meals became crowded affairs with children running underfoot, and women helping Mrs. Brennan in the kitchen, and men talking in low, angry voices about what Crow would do next. Clara threw herself into the work. She refined the Water Alliance proposal, drafted contracts, worked with Elias to identify which ranchers would be most receptive to joining. She kept the books, managed supplies, helped care for the refugee children, and slowly learned how to shoot a rifle with enough accuracy to hit a target more often than not. The days blurred together in a haze of activity. Clara fell into bed exhausted each night, barely aware of Elias settling in beside her before sleep dragged her under. But she was also aware of something shifting between them. Small moments that accumulated weight. His hand steadying her when she stumbled carrying water buckets. Her mending a tear in his shirt without being asked. The way they'd started finishing each other's sentences during planning sessions. How he'd begun asking her opinion before making decisions, and actually listening to her answers. They were becoming partners. Not in the way her father had arranged, but in a way that felt earned. 3 weeks after Clara had decided to stay, Elias called a meeting of the nearby ranchers. It took days of riding out to remote homesteads, of persuading frightened men to leave their families long enough to attend, of convincing them that unity was their only chance at survival. The night of the meeting, 17 ranchers crowded into Red Hollow's main hall. They were hard men, weathered by years of frontier life, and they watched Clara with undisguised skepticism as she stood beside Elias at the head of the table. "Gentlemen," Elias began, "thank you for coming. I know the risk you're taking just being here. If Crow finds out we're organizing..." Whoa. "He already knows," one of the ranchers interrupted. His name was Samuel Fletcher, and he owned a small spread to the north. "My boy saw 2 of Crow's riders watching my place yesterday. They didn't even try to hide." "Then he knows we're not backing down," Elias said, "which means we need to move fast. My wife has put together a proposal for a water alliance. It's not perfect, but it gives us leverage we don't have individually." Clara stepped forward, trying to ignore the way some of the men's expressions hardened at the word wife. She laid out the proposal methodically: the fee structure, the mutual defense agreements, the shared resource management that would protect everyone's water access. "You're asking us to pay for water we've always gotten free," Fletcher said when she finished. "I'm asking you to invest in protection," Clara corrected. "Right now you're at Crow's mercy. He can cut off your water access anytime he wants by buying up the land between your ranch and the river. This alliance means that can't happen. Your access is guaranteed by contract, protected by all of us together." "And what's to stop Crow from just taking the river by force?" "Numbers," Elias said. "He can burn down one ranch at a time. He can intimidate individual families. But if all of us stand together, if we have legal contracts and mutual defense agreements, he'd have to fight an actual war to break us. And that's a war he can't afford. Not politically, not financially." The debate went on for hours. Some ranchers were convinced immediately. Others resisted, too proud or too frightened to commit. A few walked out, convinced the whole thing was doomed to fail. But by midnight, 12 ranchers had signed the Water Alliance agreement. It wasn't everyone, but it was a start. After they left, Clara and Elias sat alone in the main hall, exhausted and wired with nervous energy. 12, Clara said. "Is that enough?" "It's more than I expected. And once others see that we're serious, more will join. Unless Crow moves first, he will. The question is when and how hard." Clara looked at the stack of signed contracts on the table. 12 families who'd just painted targets on their backs by allying with Red Hollow. 12 families whose safety now depended on whether this plan worked. "What have we done?" she asked quietly. Elias reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her deliberately, and Clara felt the warmth of his calloused palm against hers like a shock. "We've given them a chance," he said. "That's more than they had yesterday." The attack came 3 days later. Clara was in the office working through supply orders when she heard the shout from the lookout. She ran to the window and saw smoke rising from the southern pasture, black and thick against the afternoon sky. By the time she reached the yard, Elias was already mounted and shouting orders. "Charlie, take 6 men and get to that fire. Tommy, James, ride to the Morrison place and the Fletcher spread. Make sure they're not under attack too. Everyone else, defensive positions around the house." "What can I do?" Clara called. Elias wheeled his horse around. "Stay inside, keep the women and children calm. If anyone comes near this house that you don't recognize, shoot first and ask questions later." Then he was gone, riding hard toward the smoke with half the ranch hands behind him. Mrs. Brennan appeared at Clara's elbow. "Come on, we need to get everyone together and prepare for the worst." The worst turned out to be 3 hours of agonizing waiting. Clara gathered all the women and children in the main hall, helped barricade the doors, made sure every woman who could shoot had a rifle. Sarah Morrison was shaking so badly she could barely hold her weapon. "They're coming for us," she kept saying. "They're going to burn us out like they burned us out before." "No one's burning anything," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "Red Hollow has defenses. We're ready for them." But she kept thinking about Elias riding into danger, about how easily a man could die in a fight like this, about how she'd only just started to understand what they might be building together and how quickly it could all be destroyed. When the men finally returned as the sun was setting, Clara ran out to meet them. Elias dismounted, his face blackened with smoke, his shirt torn. "Is everyone... No casualties on our side," he said. "The fire was set deliberately at 3 different points, but we got to it fast enough to control it. Lost maybe 50 acres of grazing land, but it could have been worse. And Crow's men? Gone before we got there. They're hit-and-run tactics. They want to wear us down, make us afraid." "Is it working?" Clara asked. Elias looked at her, and she saw exhaustion and determination warring in his expression. Not yet. That night, lying in the darkness with Elias on the other side of the pillow barrier, Clara couldn't sleep. Every sound made her tense. Was that hoofbeats? Footsteps? Another attack beginning? "You're not sleeping," Elias said quietly. "Neither are you." "I'm used to it. You're not." Clara rolled onto her side to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the darkness. "Do you think we can win this?" "Be honest." He was quiet for a long time. "I think Crow has more money and more men. I think he's willing to go further than I am, to hurt innocent people, to burn and kill and terrorize. And I think that if we're not smart and lucky and stubborn enough, he'll destroy everything we're trying to build. That's not very reassuring." "You asked for honesty." "What I'm hearing is that you think we're going to lose." "No." His voice was firm. "What I think is that we're in a fight we can't afford to lose. So we'll find a way to win, even if it costs us everything." Clara thought about what everything might mean. The ranch, certainly. Their lives, possibly. All those families who'd signed the alliance agreements, trusting that Red Hollow could protect them. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. It's the people who aren't scared who make fatal mistakes." "Are you scared?" Another long pause. "Yes, especially now that I have something to lose beyond just the ranch." Clara's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" She felt him shift, moving closer until the pillow barrier was the only thing between them. "You know what I mean." She did. Somewhere in the past few weeks, this arrangement of convenience had transformed into something neither of them had planned for, something that made the stakes impossibly higher. "Elias, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. In case—" "Don't," Clara interrupted. "Don't talk about in case. We're going to survive this." "You sound very certain." "I am. Because I didn't come all this way and work this hard just to let some land-grabbing tyrant take it all away." She heard him laugh softly in the darkness. "There's that stubbornness again. You said it was a survival trait. It is. And right now it might be the only thing that saves us." The next morning, Clara woke to find Elias already gone, the sheets on his side of the bed still warm. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find the house in controlled chaos. More ranch hands had arrived overnight, men from the Alliance ranches, coming to help defend Red Hollow. The war had truly begun. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Crow's men would attack, burning fields, scattering cattle, cutting fences, poisoning water sources. And the Alliance would respond, repairing damage, reinforcing defenses, riding out in groups too large for Crow's raiders to attack directly. It was exhausting, brutal work. Clara learned to function on 4 hours of sleep. She learned to organize supply chains, coordinate defense schedules, treat minor injuries when the men came back from fighting fires or chasing raiders. She learned which women could shoot and which were better suited to other work. She learned to read Elias's moods, to know when he needed her advice and when he needed her to simply stand beside him in solidarity. And slowly, grudgingly, the alliance held. More ranchers joined. Word spread across the valley about the water cooperative that was standing up to Silas Crow. Families who'd been terrorized into silence started finding their courage again. But it came at a cost. Samuel Fletcher's son was shot during a raid, took a bullet in the shoulder that barely missed his heart. One of the Morrison children fell ill from the stress and exhaustion. Two of Elias's best ranch hands decided the fight wasn't worth the risk and left for safer territory. And through it all, Crow continued to circle, patient and relentless as a wolf stalking wounded prey. Clara was in town one afternoon picking up medical supplies when she saw him. He was standing outside the general store talking with the sheriff. Or rather, the sheriff was listening while Crow talked, nodding at whatever the land baron was saying. Their eyes met across the dusty street. Crow smiled, tipped his hat, and walked directly toward her. Every instinct told Clara to run. Instead, she stood her ground. "Mrs. Mercer," Crow said, his voice pleasant as always. "What a surprise! Shopping for your little war effort?" "Shopping for ranch supplies, Mr. Crow. Same as any rancher's wife." Of course. Though I hear you're much more than just a rancher's wife these days. Organizing alliances, drawing up contracts, playing politics. Quite ambitious for a Boston girl so new to the frontier." "I'm a quick learner." Crow's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. I'm sure you are. Smart woman like you must understand that this fight your husband is waging is futile. I own half this valley already. In another year, I'll own it all. The only question is how much blood gets spilled before everyone accepts the inevitable. Clara's hands clenched on her shopping basket. The inevitable is that free men and women will always resist tyranny. You might own land, Mr. Crow, but you don't own the people who live on it. Pretty words, but words don't stop bullets, Mrs. Mercer. They don't prevent fires. They don't protect the people you care about when violence comes calling in the dark. It was a threat, barely veiled. Clara felt ice slide down her spine. If you're trying to frighten me, I'm trying to save your life, Crow interrupted, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. You seem like a decent woman who got caught up in her husband's stubbornness. I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this before people start dying. Because they will die, Mrs. Mercer, and I'd hate for you to be among them. Clara looked into the eyes of the most powerful man in the territory and thought about all the families sheltering at Red Hollow, all the children who'd lost their homes to Crow's violence, all the men and women who'd found the courage to stand up because they believed the Alliance could protect them. You may frighten this valley, Mr. Crow, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. But you will not frighten me. Crow's pleasant expression cracked slightly. Brave words. We'll see if you still feel that way when your husband's ranch is burning and there's nowhere left to run. He walked away, leaving Clara standing in the street with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. Several townspeople had watched the exchange from windows and doorways, but none had intervened. They were all too afraid of Crow to stand with her publicly. She was alone. Clara finished her shopping mechanically and drove the wagon back to Red Hollow, her mind racing. Crow's threat had been explicit. He was done with small raids and intimidation. He was planning something bigger. When she told Elias what had happened, his expression turned thunderous. He confronted you in town? In front of witnesses? He knows no one will testify against him. The sheriff is in his pocket. I should ride into town right now and what? Challenge him to a duel? That's exactly what he wants. He wants you angry and reckless. Elias paced the office like a caged animal. He threatened you directly, Clara. I can't just let that stand. You have to, because if you react emotionally, you play into his hands. We need to be smarter than him. How? How do we outsmart someone who has all the power? Clara thought about her father, about all the business battles she'd witnessed growing up. We make him overcommit. Right now, he's patient because he thinks time is on his side. But if we can provoke him into making a big move before he's ready, he might make a mistake. That's risky. A big move could destroy us. Everything we're doing is risky. But right now, we're just reacting to his attacks. We need to force him to react to us for a change. Elias stopped pacing and looked at her. What did you have in mind? Clara laid out her plan. It was dangerous, maybe reckless, but it was the kind of bold move her father would have made. The kind that either won everything or lost it all. When she finished, Elias was quiet for a long time. If this works, he finally said, we might actually survive this. If it doesn't, we were going to lose anyway. At least this way we go down fighting. He crossed the room and pulled her into an embrace. It was the first time he'd held her like this, and Clara melted into his warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and smoke and grass that clung to him. I'm glad you stayed, he said quietly. Whatever happens next, I'm glad you were stubborn enough to stay. Clara pulled back just far enough to look into his eyes. I'm glad too, even if it means standing up to land-grabbing tyrants and watching our ranch get attacked every other day. That's frontier romance for you. All the excitement, none of the poetry. She laughed despite everything, and Elias smiled. Then his expression turned serious, and he leaned down and kissed her. It was brief, tentative, a question more than a demand. Clara answered by pulling him closer, kissing him back with weeks of accumulated tension and fear, and something that might have been love if they'd had time to examine it properly. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Elias rested his forehead against hers. We should probably focus on not getting killed before we figure out what this is, he said. Probably, Clara agreed. But after we survive, we're having a serious conversation about removing that pillow barrier. His laugh was warm against her skin. Deal. The plan went into motion 2 days later, and with it, The final confrontation with Silas Crow began to take shape. The plan was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Clara would ride to every ranch in the Alliance and convince them to publicly file their water rights contracts with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Once filed, those contracts became legal record, protected by territorial law. Crow could burn barns and scatter cattle, but he couldn't erase official documents without exposing himself to federal prosecution. It would force his hand, make him choose between accepting defeat or escalating to open warfare that would bring territorial authorities down on him. "He'll choose war," Elias said the night before Clara was set to leave. They were lying in bed, the pillow barrier long since abandoned, her head resting on his chest while he absently ran his fingers through her unbound hair. "You know that, right? He's not the type to accept any outcome where he doesn't win completely." "I know," Clara said. "But at least it will be a war fought in the open, not these shadow attacks that terrorize families in the middle of the night. And once the territorial government gets involved, Crow loses his biggest advantage." "Which is?" "Nobody caring enough to stop him." Elias's hand stilled in her hair. "When did you get so ruthless?" "I had a good teacher. My father didn't build his empire by being nice." "I'm not sure if I should be impressed or concerned." Clara tilted her head to look up at him. "Be both." "That's what I am." She left at dawn with Charlie and 2 other ranch hands as escorts. The plan was to hit 6 ranches in 3 days, collect signatures on the filing authorization, then ride hard for Cheyenne to submit everything before Crow could interfere. The first 2 ranches went smoothly. Samuel Fletcher signed immediately, his injured son watching from the doorway with his arm still in a sling. The Hendersons, an older couple who'd lost half their herd to one of Crow's raids, signed with shaking hands. "You really think this will work?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her weathered face creased with worry. "I think it's our best chance," Clara said honestly, "and I think doing nothing guarantees we lose." The 3rd ranch belonged to a family named Walsh. They had 4 children under 10 and a spread so small it barely qualified as a ranch. When Clara explained the plan, Robert Walsh shook his head. "I can't. I'm sorry, but I got kids to think about. If Crow finds out I filed those papers—" "He's going to find out anyway," Clara interrupted. "All the contracts will be filed together. There's no hiding." "But that's the point. Once everything is official record, he can't target individual families without it becoming a federal case." "You don't know that. You're guessing." "I'm making the best educated guess I can with the information we have. And the alternative is waiting for him to burn you out like he's burned out everyone else who stood in his way." Walsh looked at his wife, who held their youngest child on her hip. The baby was crying softly, sensing the tension in the room. "I'm sorry," Walsh said again. "I just can't risk it." Clara wanted to argue, to convince him, but she saw the fear in his eyes and recognized it as something she couldn't overcome with logic. Some people had already been broken by Crow's campaign of terror. They were too scared to fight back, even when fighting was their only real option for survival. "I understand," she said quietly. "If you change your mind, the offer stands." They rode away from the Walsh ranch in silence. Charlie finally spoke up as they crested a ridge that gave them a view of the valley below. "You can't save everyone." "I know, but every family that doesn't join makes the alliance weaker." "Maybe. Or maybe it makes the ones who do join stronger. Quality over quantity." Clara thought about that as they rode toward the next ranch. Maybe Charlie was right. Maybe what they needed wasn't everyone, just enough people brave enough to stand together. The 4th and 5th ranches signed. By the end of the 2nd day, Clara had 9 signatures out of the 12 Alliance members. Not perfect, but enough. They camped that night in a small canyon, the horses picketed nearby, a fire burning low to avoid attracting attention. Clara sat with her back against a rock, exhausted down to her bones, and tried not to think about everything that could still go wrong. Charlie took first watch, his rifle across his knees as he scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. The other 2 men, Davis and Reed, were already snoring in their bedrolls. "You should sleep, ma'am," Charlie said. "Long ride to Cheyenne tomorrow." "I know, I just can't seem to shut my mind off. That's fear talking, gets louder in the dark." Clara looked at the old foreman with his scarred face and steady eyes. "How do you deal with it? The fear?" "Don't deal with it. Just accept it's there and keep moving anyway. Fear's not the problem. It's letting fear stop you from doing what needs doing that'll kill you out here." Very philosophical. Charlie smiled. I'm old, ma'am. Comes with the territory. Now get some sleep before I start sharing more of my accumulated wisdom. Clara did sleep, though fitfully, and woke before dawn to the smell of coffee and the sound of horses being saddled. They ate a quick breakfast of jerky and hardtack, then mounted up for the final leg to Cheyenne. The territorial capital was 2 days hard riding from their current position. If they pushed the horses and didn't run into trouble, they could make it by late afternoon the following day. They ran into trouble. It happened on a narrow trail that cut through rocky terrain. One moment they were riding single file, Clara behind Charlie with Davis and Reed bringing up the rear. The next moment gunfire exploded from the rocks above them. Charlie's horse screamed and went down, throwing the old foreman hard into the dirt. Clara yanked Maple's reins, trying to control the terrified mare as more shots rang out. Behind her, she heard Reed curse and Davis return fire. "Get down!" Charlie shouted, already scrambling toward cover despite his fall. They got the high ground. Clara half fell, half jumped from the saddle, and dove behind a boulder as bullets kicked up dust where she'd been standing. Her heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe. She fumbled for the rifle in her saddle scabbard, but Maple had bolted with the other horses, leaving Clara trapped behind inadequate cover with armed men shooting at her from above. This was how it ended, she thought with strange clarity. Shot in a canyon by Crow's hired guns, the Alliance contract still in her saddlebags, the whole plan dying with her. Then Charlie was beside her, blood running down the side of his face from where he'd hit the ground. "You hurt?" "No. Are you?" "I'll live. Davis, Reed, position." "East side," Davis called back. "I count 4 shooters." "Could be more," Reed added, punctuating his words with rifle fire. 4 men, possibly more, with the advantage of elevation and cover. Clara did the math and didn't like the answer. "We need to move," Charlie said. "Can't stay pinned down here. That copse of trees, maybe 50 yards. Think you can make it?" Clara looked at the distance and the exposed ground between their current position and relative safety. "Do I have a choice?" "Not really. On 3. 1. He didn't make it to 3. More gunfire erupted, this time from a different direction, and for a moment Clara thought they were completely surrounded. Then she heard whooping and the thunder of hooves and realized the new shooters were firing at Crow's men, not at them. Riders poured into the canyon, maybe 10 of them, rifles blazing. Clara recognized Tommy and James from Red Hollow, and beside them were men from the Alliance ranches. Samuel Fletcher's injured son was there, his arm still bandaged but his rifle steady. Henderson and Morrison and others, all of them laying down covering fire that sent Crow's ambushers scrambling for better positions. "Elias sent them," Charlie said, something like wonder in his voice. He figured Crow might try something and sent backup. The ambushers broke and ran, disappearing into the rocks like smoke. The Alliance riders pursued briefly, then circled back to where Clara and her escorts were regrouping. Tommy swung down from his horse, grinning. "Looks like we got here just in time." "What are you doing here?" Clara asked, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "Boss said you'd need help. Told us to trail you at a distance, stay out of sight unless trouble showed up. Guess he was right about the trouble part." Clara felt something warm unfold in her chest. Elias had known she'd be targeted, had known and prepared for it without telling her, without making her feel like she needed protection. He'd just quietly made sure she'd have it. "Anyone hurt?" Charlie asked, checking his men. Davis had a graze on his arm. Nothing serious. Reed was fine. Charlie's head wound looked worse than it was. The ambushers had gotten away, but Clara and her party were alive. "We need to keep moving," Clara said, gathering Maple's reins from where Tommy had caught the mare. "If Crow knows we're heading to Cheyenne, he'll try again." "Let him try," Tommy said. "We got numbers now, and we're done running from his hired thugs." They rode hard for Cheyenne, the expanded group making better time despite their increased numbers. Clara kept expecting another ambush, but maybe the show of force had convinced Crow's men that the cost of stopping them was too high. Or maybe they were just regrouping for another attempt. Cheyenne appeared on the horizon near sunset the following day, a sprawling territorial capital that looked almost civilized compared to Red Hollow. Buildings lined actual streets. There were churches and schools and businesses that didn't double as saloons. Clara felt like she'd stepped back into the world she'd left behind when she boarded that train in Boston. The land office was closing when they arrived, but Clara talked their way inside by sheer force of will. The clerk was an exhausted-looking man in his 50s who clearly wanted to go home. Water rights contracts, Clara said, placing the stack of papers on his desk. We need these filed as official territorial record. The clerk peered at the documents over his spectacles. This is Red Hollow Ranch and associated properties? That's right. You're aware there are challenges pending on some of these water rights? Silas Crow filed contestations last month claiming prior usage, and Mr. Crow doesn't have prior usage, Clara interrupted. These contracts are based on documented water rights going back 15 years. His contestations are harassment, not legitimate legal claims. The clerk blinked at her. Be that as it may, ma'am, filing these will trigger a formal review process. Could take months, maybe years, if it goes to territorial court. I understand. File them anyway. The fees are... Clara dropped a leather pouch on his desk. It made a heavy sound that suggested considerable gold content. That should cover filing fees for all contracts, plus expedited processing. The clerk opened the pouch, counted quickly, and his expression changed. Yes, ma'am. I believe this will indeed cover all necessary fees. I'll get these processed first thing tomorrow morning. Tonight, Clara said firmly. We need time-stamped filing receipts tonight, before this office closes. Those contracts need to be on record before anyone tries to interfere. The clerk looked at the gold, at Clara's determined face, and sighed. It'll take a few hours. We'll wait. They did wait. All of them, crowding into the land office lobby while the clerk worked. Charlie sent Tommy and James to get food and bring it back. They ate cold sandwiches and drank bad coffee while the sun set over Cheyenne and the clerk's pen scratched across forms and ledgers. It was nearly midnight when he finally emerged with a stack of receipts, each one stamped and signed and official. Filed and recorded, he said, handing them to Clara. The Red Hollow Water Alliance is now territorial record. Any disputes will have to go through proper legal channels. Clara took the receipts with hands that shook slightly. It was done. The alliance was real, official, protected by territorial law. Now they just had to survive Crow's response. They spent the night in Cheyenne's single hotel, Clara sharing a room with 3 other women who'd made the trip while the men crowded into the other available rooms or slept in the stable. Clara should have been exhausted, but she lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about Elias back at Red Hollow, wondering if Crow had attacked while they were gone. She sent a telegram first thing in the morning, simple and direct, contracts filed, coming home. The return ride took 3 days, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. Clara felt the weight of those filing receipts in her saddlebag like a physical thing. They represented hope, but also a declaration of war. Crow would know by now what they'd done. The question was how he'd respond. They saw the smoke when they were still 5 miles from Red Hollow, black columns rising into the afternoon sky, thick and ominous. That's not a prairie fire, Charlie said, his voice tight. That's buildings burning, Tommy added. Clara kicked Maple into a gallop, fear overriding caution. The mare ran flat out, eating up the distance while Clara's mind raced with terrible possibilities. The ranch house burning, Elias hurt or dead, all those families who'd sheltered at Red Hollow caught in the flames. She crested the final ridge and saw Red Hollow Ranch spread below her. The northern pasture was burning, flames racing across dried grass. But the main buildings were intact. Clara could see people moving in organized chaos, forming bucket lines from the well, beating back flames with wet blankets, creating fire breaks by clearing vegetation. And in the center of it all, directing operations with calm authority, was Elias. Relief hit Clara so hard she nearly fell from the saddle. He was alive. The ranch was damaged but not destroyed. They'd survived whatever Crow had thrown at them. She rode down into the ranch yard at a dead run, pulling Maple up in a spray of dirt and dismounting before the mare had fully stopped. Elias turned at the commotion and his face transformed. He crossed the distance between them in long strides and pulled Clara into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. You're back, he said against her hair. Thank God you're back. What happened? Crow's men hit us 2 nights ago, set fires in 3 different locations, tried to draw us out and scatter, but we were ready. Everyone knew their positions, had practiced the drills. We lost some grazing land, but nothing critical. Anyone hurt? A few burns, nothing serious. Mrs. Brennan has been running the medical station like a field general. Clara pulled back to look at him. His face was blackened with soot, his shirt torn, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. You knew this would happen. That's why you sent backup to trail us. I knew Crow would try something, either attack you or attack here while we were distracted. Figured having extra guns following you at a distance covered both scenarios. The contracts are filed. It's done. Elias's expression shifted to something fierce and triumphant. Then we won. Maybe not the war, but this battle at least. He's not going to stop. No. But now he has to fight us legally as well as physically, and that's a fight he can't win quietly. They stood together watching the controlled chaos of fighting the fires, and Clara felt the weight of what they'd accomplished settle over her. The alliance was real. The contracts were filed. Crow's power was no longer absolute, but the cost was still being counted in burned acres and frightened families, and the exhausted determination on every face she saw. Over the following week, news spread through the valley about the filed contracts. 3 more ranchers joined the alliance, emboldened by the official recognition. The Territorial Land Commissioner sent a letter acknowledging receipt of the filings and informing all parties that any disputes would be handled through proper legal channels. It was a victory, but it felt hollow when Clara watched children wake screaming from nightmares about fires, or saw Sarah Morrison flinch every time a horse approached too quickly. We broke something in them, Clara said to Elias one night. They were sitting on the porch, the ranch finally quiet after another long day. These families, they came here looking for safety, and all we've given them is more fear. You gave them hope, Elias corrected. Before the alliance, they were isolated and helpless. Now they're part of something bigger. That matters. Does it matter enough? When children are having nightmares and women are afraid to let their husbands leave the house? Elias took her hand. This is what fighting back looks like. It's not clean or easy or without casualties, but it's better than surrender. Is it? Sometimes I wonder if my father was right, if I'm too stubborn for my own good, dragging everyone else into my fight. This isn't your fight. It's ours. All of us. And yes, you're stubborn. But that stubbornness is what's kept this alliance together when everyone wanted to give up. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. I miss Boston sometimes. The safety of it. Knowing that the worst thing that could happen was embarrassment at a social function. Do you want to go back? She thought about it honestly. No. Even with everything that's happened, I'd rather be here fighting with you than back there being safe and useless. You were never useless. I felt useless, like I was just decorative furniture in my father's house, waiting for him to find the right buyer. Elias pulled her closer. You're the furthest thing from decorative furniture I've ever met. You're a force of nature wrapped in Boston manners and stubborn determination. Clara laughed despite everything. That might be the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. I'm working on my poetry. Give me time. We might not have time. Crow's not done with us. No, Elias agreed, but neither are we done with him. The confrontation came sooner than either expected. Crow rode into Red Hollow 3 days later with 15 armed men, arriving at noon when the ranch was at its busiest. Clara was in the garden when the shout went up. She dropped the vegetables she'd been harvesting and ran to the house, her heart already racing. By the time she reached the porch, Elias was there with every available ranch hand, all of them armed, facing down Crow's small army. That's far enough, Elias called out when Crow's men were still 20 yards from the house. You're not welcome here. Crow stopped, his expensive horse prancing nervously. I'm not here for a fight, Mercer. I'm here to talk business. We've got no business to discuss. Oh, I think we do. You see, I received some interesting news from Cheyenne. Seems you filed a bunch of water contracts with the Territorial Land Office. Very official, very legal. Crow's smile was cold, also very stupid. Those contracts are binding, Clara said, stepping up beside Elias. You can't contest them without exposing yourself to federal scrutiny. Mrs. Mercer, still interfering in matters you don't understand, I see. Crow's eyes raked over her with open contempt. Let me explain something. I've been building my empire in this valley for 20 years. I own the sheriff, half the territorial legislature, and enough judges to ensure that any legal challenge to my interests dies in court. Your contracts are just paper, and paper burns. Is that a threat? Elias asked, his hand resting on his gun. It's a fact, but I'm a reasonable man, so I'm giving you one final chance. Sell me Red Hollow. I'll pay fair market value. let you walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. Your alliance friends can keep their small ranches for now. I'll leave them alone. For now, Clara repeated, until you've consolidated power and can pick them off individually. Eventually, yes, but that's not your problem if you're smart enough to take my offer and leave. Elias's jaw tightened. I've told you before, Crow. I'm not selling. Not now, not ever. This ranch is mine, and I'll defend it with everything I have. Including your wife's life? Crow's voice went soft and dangerous. Because I've been very patient, Mercer. But my patience has limits, and when I finally lose it, people who stand in my way tend to have unfortunate accidents. The threat hung in the air like a physical thing. Clara felt every eye on the ranch turn toward her, measuring, calculating. This was the moment, she realized. The point where she could step back, let Elias handle it, play the proper frontier wife who deferred to her husband in matters of business and violence. Or she could stand her ground. Clara walked down from the porch, crossing the space between Elias's defensive line and Crow's mounted men. She heard Elias curse behind her, heard Mrs. Brennan gasp, but she didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of Crow's horse. The land baron looked down at her with something like surprise. "You made a mistake, Mr. Crow," Clara said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "You assumed that because I'm a woman, I'd be easy to frighten, that threatening me would make my husband back down." "Mrs. Mercer, I'm not finished. You've spent 20 years building power by terrorizing people who were alone and afraid. But we're not alone anymore. And I'm not afraid. Your threats mean nothing. Your money means nothing. Your judges and sheriffs and bought politicians mean nothing. Because eventually, the territorial government will send someone you don't own, and all of this," she gestured at Crow and his men, "will come crashing down." Crow's face darkened. "You're making a fatal error." "No. You are. You thought you could win through intimidation, but you've just made this personal, and I promise you, Mr. Crow, you do not want this to be personal, because I will spend every day, every resource, every bit of influence I have making sure you lose. Not just this valley. Everything." Big words from a Boston girl playing at frontier life. "I'm not playing anymore." Clara turned her back on him deliberately, an insult no frontier man could ignore, and walked back to the porch. Every step felt like it took an hour. Every second she expected to hear the sound of a gun cocking, feel a bullet slam between her shoulder blades. But nothing happened. She reached Elias's side, and only then did she allow herself to breathe. Crow sat on his horse for a long moment, fury and calculation warring on his face. Finally, he spoke. "You'll regret this conversation, Mrs. Mercer. Both of you. I tried to be reasonable. I offered you a way out. Now there's only one way this ends." "With you losing," Clara said. Crow's smile was terrible. "We'll see. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. It won't be long." He wheeled his horse and rode out, his men following. They left behind a silence so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then Elias grabbed her arm and pulled her inside the house, away from watching eyes. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, and she could hear the fear beneath the anger. "He could have shot you right there." "He wouldn't, not in front of witnesses. It would undermine everything he's built." "You don't know that. He's capable of anything." "So am I." Clara met his eyes steadily. Someone had to stand up to him, really stand up to him, not just refuse to sell, but actually challenge his power directly. If we're going to survive this, Crow needs to understand that we're not afraid. Even if you are afraid? Especially then. Elias pulled her close, and she felt him shaking. "Don't do that again. Don't risk yourself like that." "I can't promise that. This is who I am now. This is who the frontier made me." He laughed shakily against her hair. "The frontier and your own stubborn nature. That too." They stood together while the ranch gradually returned to normal activity outside. But both of them knew normal was an illusion. Crow had declared war openly, and the real battle was only beginning. That night, Elias called a meeting of all the Alliance ranchers who could make it to Red Hollow. They gathered in the main hall, faces grim, knowing that Crow's confrontation meant the situation had escalated beyond raids and intimidation. "He's going to come at us hard," Elias said without preamble. "No more small attacks. He wants to make an example of Red Hollow, show everyone what happens when you stand up to him." "Then we need to be ready," Samuel Fletcher said. His injured son stood beside him, the bandage finally removed from his arm. We post guards, coordinate patrols, make sure no ranch is left undefended. That spreads us thin, someone pointed out. Being spread thin beats being picked off individually, Clara said. She'd been standing at the back of the room, but now she moved forward, laying a map across the table. We rotate defense. Each ranch gets 3 days of concentrated protection from Alliance members. Then we move to the next ranch. Crow can't hit all of us at once, and if he tries for a defended position, we'll have enough guns to make him pay. The ranchers studied the map, the rotation schedule, the defensive positions she'd marked. This could work, Henderson said slowly. But it means leaving our families alone for days at a time while we're helping defend other ranches. Families can shelter here, Mrs. Brennan said from the doorway. We've been doing it already. Red Hollow's big enough to house everyone during their rotation. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing about this situation was perfect. But it was a plan, and plans gave people hope that they could survive what was coming. The ranchers agreed. The rotation schedule was finalized. Families began arriving at Red Hollow the next day, turning the ranch into something between a military camp and a refugee settlement. Clara threw herself into organizing the chaos. She coordinated supply distribution, managed the schedule, kept the financial records that showed them burning through resources at an unsustainable rate. She helped care for children, mediated disputes between families living in too close quarters, and tried not to think about what would happen when their money ran out. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The attacks continued but less frequently and never at defended positions. Crow was probing for weakness, testing their resolve. Clara began to think they might actually survive this. Then one morning, a rider came from the north at a full gallop, his horse lathered and nearly dead from exhaustion. "Fire!" he shouted before he'd even dismounted. "Massive fire across the northern range. It's heading straight for the valley." Elias was moving before the man finished speaking, shouting orders, organizing the response. Within minutes, every able-bodied person was mounting up or grabbing equipment. Clara stood in the chaos, understanding with sick certainty what was happening. This wasn't another small raid. This was Crow's endgame, and it was just beginning. The smoke was visible within minutes, a dark wall rising on the northern horizon like a storm made of ash and fury. Clara stood in the ranch yard watching men scramble to their horses, checking weapons and water barrels, their faces tight with the knowledge that this was different from anything they'd faced before. "How fast is it moving?" Elias asked the exhausted rider who'd brought the warning. "Fast. Wind's pushing it south at maybe 3 miles an hour. If it doesn't slow down or change direction, it'll hit the valley by nightfall." "That's impossible. Prairie fires don't move that fast unless someone set it in multiple locations," Charlie finished grimly. "This is deliberate. Crow's trying to burn us out." Clara's mind raced through the implications. A fire that size would consume everything in its path: grass, buildings, livestock. People who couldn't escape in time. And with the wind pushing it toward the valley, every ranch in the Alliance was in danger. "We need to split up," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Half our men to fight the fire directly, the other half to evacuate the northern ranches before the flames reach them." Elias turned to her, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing the same variables she was, coming to the same terrible conclusion. "If we split our forces, we won't have enough men to stop the fire. We're not going to stop it anyway, not a fire that size, but we can slow it down and save the families in its path. And if Crow's men use the chaos to attack Red Hollow while we're scattered?" Clara had thought of that too. "Then we defend with who we have left." It was a risk, maybe a fatal one, but leaving families to burn wasn't an option either. Elias made the decision in seconds. "Charlie, take 20 men north. Evacuate every ranch in the fire's path. Don't try to save property, just get people and livestock moving south. Tommy, you're with me. We're going to cut fire breaks and try to channel this thing away from the main settlements." "What about Red Hollow?" Mrs. Brennan asked from the porch, her voice steady despite the fear Clara could see in her face. "We leave 10 men here for defense. Clara, you're in command of the ranch until I get back." Clara nodded, trying not to let her terror show. In command meant responsible for everyone who stayed behind. All the women and children who'd sheltered here, trusting that Red Hollow could protect them. Elias crossed to her quickly, pulled her close despite the watching audience. "If Crow's men come, Don't try to be a hero. Get everyone into the root cellar and hold position. The walls are stone. They'll protect you from fire and bullets both. What if they try to smoke us out? Then you use the escape tunnel that leads to the creek bed. It's hidden behind the potato bins. Mrs. Brennan knows where it is. Clara pulled back to look at him. You have an escape tunnel and never mentioned it? Hoped I'd never need to, but I'm not stupid. This ranch was built to survive a siege. He kissed her hard and fast. Stay alive, that's an order. Come back, that's an order from me. He smiled despite everything, then swung up onto his horse. Within minutes, the ranch yard was empty except for the 10 men assigned to defense and the cluster of women and children watching the smoke grow on the horizon. Mrs. Brennan appeared at Clara's elbow. Well, I suppose you'd better tell us what the plan is. Clara took a breath, steadying herself. She was 20 years old, had been on the frontier for less than 3 months, and was now responsible for defending a ranch against potential attack while a massive wildfire bore down on the valley. Her father would have said she was completely unqualified for this, and maybe she was, but these people needed someone to lead, and she was what they had. Everyone into the house, Clara said, her voice carrying across the yard. Bring whatever you need for a long wait, food, water, medicine. We're going to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The women moved with practiced efficiency, gathering children, organizing supplies. They'd been living with the threat of violence for weeks now. Fear had become routine. Sarah Morrison caught Clara's arm as they filed into the house. That fire. My children can see it from the window. They're asking if we're going to burn. We're not going to burn. The walls of this house are stone, and we have water from the well. Even if the fire reaches us, we can survive it. You sound very certain. I'm certain we're going to do everything possible to survive. That's the best any of us can manage right now. Inside, Clara organized defensive positions. 2 men on the roof as lookouts, 2 more at windows facing north and south, the remaining 6 stationed at doors and strategic points throughout the house. All the women who could shoot were given rifles and assigned fallback positions. If they come, they'll try to draw us out, Clara explained, spreading a rough map on the dining table. Set a fire or create a distraction to make us leave the house. Don't fall for it. We stay inside, we stay together, and we make them come to us if they want to fight. And if they just burn us out? One of the younger women asked, her voice shaking. Then we use the tunnel, but I don't think they will. Crow wants Red Hollow intact. He's trying to drive us away, not destroy the property he plans to claim. It was a guess, but a logical one. Everything Crow had done suggested he wanted control of Red Hollow's water rights, not a pile of ash. The hours crawled by. Clara moved through the house checking on people, redistributing supplies, keeping everyone busy enough that panic didn't have time to take hold. The smoke grew thicker, blotting out the afternoon sun and turning the light orange and sickly. One of the children started crying, a thin wail that set off 2 others. Their mothers tried to comfort them, but Clara could see the fear spreading. She knelt down beside the crying children, all 3 of them under 5 years old. Hey, do you know what I did the first night I arrived at Red Hollow? They shook their heads, sniffling. I cried too. I was scared and far from home and everything was different. But you know what I learned? Being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you smart. Only stupid people aren't scared of dangerous things. Are you scared now? One of the children asked, terrified. But I'm also going to make sure we all stay safe, because that's what grown-ups do. We get scared, and then we do what needs doing anyway. It seemed to help. The crying subsided to sniffles, then stopped altogether as the children's mothers distracted them with food and quiet games. Mrs. Brennan watched this exchange with something like approval. You're better at this than you think. At lying to children about how dangerous things are. At giving people hope when there's precious little of it to spare. The lookout on the roof called down just before dusk. Riders approaching. Can't tell how many yet, but they're coming fast. Clara's heart kicked into overdrive. She ran to the window, straining to see through the smoky air. There, silhouettes emerging from the haze, maybe a dozen of them. Positions, she called out. Everyone to your assigned spots. Stay calm and wait for my signal. The women moved quickly, rifles ready, faces set with determination. Clara positioned herself at the main window with one of the ranch hands, a young man named Peter, who looked barely old enough to shave. You ever shoot at a person before? She asked him quietly. No, ma'am. Neither have I. Let's hope we don't have to start today. The riders came closer. Clara's finger rested on the trigger, her palms sweating despite the cool air. She tried to remember everything Elias had taught her about shooting. Breathe steady, aim center mass, don't jerk the trigger. Then she recognized the lead rider and nearly collapsed with relief. "Hold fire!" she shouted. "It's Charlie!" The ranch hands lowered their weapons as Charlie and his group thundered into the yard. But relief turned to confusion when Clara saw how many people were with them. Not just the men Charlie had taken north, but dozens of others. Entire families on horseback and in wagons, livestock trailing behind, all of them covered in ash and exhaustion. Clara ran outside as Charlie dismounted. His face was black with soot, his eyes red and streaming. "We got them out," he said, coughing. "All the northern ranches. Nobody left behind." "The fire?" "Still coming. Elias and the others are trying to turn it, but I don't know if they can. That thing's a monster, Clara. I've never seen anything like it." More wagons kept arriving, an endless stream of refugees pouring into Red Hollow. Clara felt panic rising. They didn't have room for this many people, didn't have supplies or shelter, or she forced herself to think. This wasn't the time for panic. These people had nowhere else to go. "Mrs. Brennan?" Clara called. "We need the barn opened up for shelter. Get every blanket and bit of food we have. Sarah, can you help organize the children? We need to keep them together and calm." The ranch transformed into controlled chaos. Women worked to set up makeshift sleeping areas in the barn. Men tended to exhausted horses and frightened livestock. Children huddled together, too shocked to cry. A woman Clara didn't recognize grabbed her arm. "My husband stayed behind to fight the fire. Thomas Henderson." "Do you know if—" "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "But Elias is with them, and he won't leave anyone behind. We just have to wait." It was a long wait. Night fell, and the smoke turned the darkness absolute. Clara stood on the porch, watching the northern horizon glow orange and red, listening to the distant roar of flames consuming everything in their path. This was what Crow had wanted: total destruction. A valley so devastated that the survivors would have no choice but to sell to him at whatever price he offered. Unless they could stop it. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Clara dozed standing up, jerking awake every time a noise suggested riders approaching. But no one came. Not Elias, not Crow's men, just the endless night and the distant fire. Dawn broke gray and hazy. The smoke had grown thicker overnight, turning the sun into a dim red disk barely visible through the haze. Clara's eyes burned. Her throat felt raw from breathing ash-filled air. Then someone shouted, "Riders coming in!" Clara's heart leaped. She ran to the edge of the porch, straining to see through the smoke. Shapes emerged, men on horseback, moving slow like they could barely stay in the saddle. Elias was at the front, his face so blackened with soot she almost didn't recognize him. Behind him came what was left of his firefighting crew, maybe 15 men, where 20 had ridden out. Clara was down the steps before she consciously decided to move, running across the yard as Elias dismounted. He caught her, held her tight, and she felt him shaking with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "Did you stop it?" she asked against his chest. "We turned it, cut fire breaks, and used the creek as a natural barrier. The fire's burning itself out against the western ridge now. It won't reach the valley." "You saved us." "We saved ourselves. All of us together." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bloodshot but alive. "Crow?" "Never showed. I think he expected us to evacuate entirely, leave Red Hollow undefended so he could claim it. Then he underestimated you. Again!" Tommy appeared beside them, swaying on his feet. "Boss, we got casualties, burns, smoke inhalation, and Henderson's missing. He was with the Eastern team and nobody's seen him since the fire jumped the break." Clara felt her stomach drop. That was the woman's husband who'd asked about him. Thomas Henderson. "Get search parties organized," Elias said immediately. "He might be hurt and unable to ride. Clara, we need medical supplies and someone who knows what they're doing with burns. Mrs. Brennan has been treating minor injuries all night. I'll get her organized for worse." The next hours blurred together in exhaustion and crisis management. Men went back out to search for Henderson. Women tended to the injured, applying salve to burns and binding wounds. Children finally broke down and cried, the shock wearing off to leave behind raw terror. They found Henderson just before noon, unconscious but alive in a creek bed 2 miles from Red Hollow. He'd been trying to make his way back when smoke inhalation finally knocked him out. Mrs. Brennan said he'd survive, though his lungs would never be quite right again. His wife wept with relief, and Clara felt something in her chest unknot slightly. One life saved. It wasn't much against all the destruction, but it was something. Elias found her late that afternoon, sitting on the porch steps and staring at nothing. He lowered himself down beside her with a groan that spoke to muscles pushed past their limit. "We lost maybe 100,000 acres," he said without preamble. "Most of it grazing land, but some homesteads burned too. The Morrison place is gone completely. So is the Fletcher house and 3 others. But the people survived. The people survived. And that's what matters." He paused. "Crow made his move and we survived it. That's going to cost him." "How?" "He burned half the valley, destroyed homes. That sounds like a victory to me." "It's a Pyrrhic victory. He didn't break us, didn't drive us out, and now everyone knows exactly what he's willing to do, including the territorial authorities." As if summoned by the mention of authorities, a rider approached from the south. Not one of their people, but a stranger in a dust-covered suit riding a horse that looked like it had come a long way. Elias stood, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Clara rose beside him. The rider stopped in front of the house and dismounted. He was perhaps 40, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that took in everything with the efficiency of someone trained to notice details. "Elias Mercer?" he asked. "That's me." "Marshal William Grant, Territorial Enforcement Office. I received reports about a series of fires in this valley that appeared to be deliberately set. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Clara felt something shift in her chest. Finally someone in authority was paying attention. "We've got a lot to tell you, Marshal," Elias said, "and evidence to back it up. You might want to get comfortable. This is going to take a while." They spent 3 hours with Marshal Grant, laying out everything. The intimidation, the attacks, the pattern of violence that had terrorized the valley for years. Clara produced the ledgers she'd been keeping, documentation of every raid and burned barn and family driven out. Elias provided names and dates. Other ranchers came forward with their own testimony. By the time they finished, Grant's expression was grim. "This is enough for me to open a formal investigation," he said. "But I have to warn you, Silas Crow has powerful friends. This won't be easy." "We're not asking for easy," Clara said. "We're asking for justice." "Fair enough. I'll need some of you to ride to Cheyenne with me tomorrow, give formal statements, and I'll need access to those ledgers you've been keeping, Mrs. Mercer. They're yours, along with copies of all the filed water rights contracts and evidence of Crow's attempts to interfere with legal territorial business." Grant looked at Clara with something like respect. "You've been thorough. I learned from the best. My father built a business empire by documenting everything and using the legal system to destroy his competitors. I'm just applying his methods to a different kind of war." After Grant left to set up camp with some of the ranch hands, Clara and Elias finally had a moment alone. They walked to the eastern pasture, away from the crowds of people sheltering at the ranch, and stood looking out at the smoke-hazed valley. "Do you think it will work?" Clara asked. "The investigation?" "I think it's our best chance. Grant seems like a straight shooter, and if even half of what we told him checks out, Crow's going to have serious legal problems." "But," Elias sighed, "but men like Crow don't go down easy. He'll fight this with everything he has. And desperate men do desperate things. So we're not safe yet. We're not safe until Crow is behind bars or run out of the territory, and maybe not even then." They stood in silence for a long moment. Clara was so tired she could barely stand, but sleep felt impossible. There was too much to do, too many people depending on them, too many ways this could still go wrong. "I keep thinking about that first day," she said quietly, "when I stepped off the train and you told me I'd never be afraid of you. Remember that?" "I remember. I was afraid anyway. Not of you, but of everything else. The space, the emptiness, the harshness of this place. I thought it would break me. But it didn't. No. It made me into something I never knew I could be. Someone strong enough to stand up to men like Crow. Someone who can defend a ranch and lead people and make impossible decisions." She turned to look at him. "I don't know if I like who I've become, but I'm not sure I can go back to who I was before." Elias pulled her close. "The frontier changes everyone who comes here. Breaks some people, like Mrs. Patterson said on that first day. But the ones it doesn't break, it forges into something stronger than they ever imagined. Is that what happened to you?" "That's what happened to both of us." They walked back to the house together as the sun set behind the smoke, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked too much like fire. Red Hollow Ranch was scarred, surrounded by refugees, under threat from a powerful enemy who'd just proven exactly how far he was willing to go. But they were still standing, still fighting, still refusing to break. The next morning, Clara rode to Cheyenne with Marshal Grant, along with Elias and 4 other ranchers who'd agreed to testify. They left Charlie in charge of Red Hollow's defense, with strict instructions to send word immediately if Crow made any moves. The ride took 2 days, and Clara spent most of it rehearsing her testimony. Everything she'd witnessed, everything she'd documented, every piece of evidence that could be used to build a case against Crow. In Cheyenne, the territorial courthouse was an imposing stone building that represented law and order in a territory that often had precious little of either. Clara stood on the steps looking up at it and felt something like hope stirring in her chest. Maybe civilization could reach even here. Maybe justice was possible, even against men who seemed untouchable. The formal hearings took 3 days. Clara testified for hours, presenting her ledgers and contracts and carefully documented evidence. Elias and the other ranchers told their stories. More witnesses arrived, families who'd been burned out, ranch hands who'd been threatened, even a few of Crow's former employees who'd grown disgusted with his methods. The case against Silas Crow grew stronger by the hour. On the evening of the 3rd day, Marshal Grant found Clara outside the courthouse. "We've got enough. I'm issuing a warrant for Crow's arrest on charges of arson, intimidation, conspiracy to commit fraud, and about a dozen other violations of territorial law." "When?" "Tomorrow. I'm taking a federal marshal and 20 armed men to serve it. He won't come quietly, but he'll come." Clara felt dizzy with relief and terror. This was it. The moment everything either came together or fell apart. "I want to be there when you arrest him." Grant shook his head. "That's not a good idea, Mrs. Mercer. This could turn violent." "All the more reason for me to be there. He threatened me directly. I have a right to see him answer for it." "Your husband won't like this." "My husband will understand that I didn't come this far to miss the ending." Grant studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You can ride with us, but you stay back when we make the arrest. No heroics." "No heroics," Clara agreed, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise if things went wrong. They rode out before dawn, a force of armed law enforcement officers heading toward Crow's massive ranch compound. Clara rode near the back of the column, her rifle across her saddle and her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. This was where it ended. One way or another, the war for Red Hollow Valley would be decided today. Crow's ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun rose, a sprawling operation that made Red Hollow look small by comparison. Dozens of buildings, hundreds of cattle, wealth and power displayed with arrogant confidence. Marshal Grant raised his hand to halt the column just out of rifle range. "Mrs. Mercer, you stay here with the rear guard. Rest of you, weapons ready but holstered. We do this by the book." The lawmen approached Crow's main house in formation. Clara watched from a distance, her hands tight on the reins. Crow emerged onto his porch, flanked by armed men. Even from here, Clara could see the rage on his face as he recognized Marshal Grant. Words were exchanged, too distant for Clara to hear. Then Crow laughed, the sound carrying across the morning air. He said something, gestured dismissively. His men raised their rifles. Marshal Grant didn't back down. He held up the warrant, his voice carrying now. "Silas Crow, you're under arrest by order of the territorial court. You can come peacefully or in chains, your choice." "The only choice here is whether you leave on your horses or in coffins," Crow replied. "I own this territory. Your warrant means nothing. Federal law says otherwise. Federal law is whatever I decide it is. Now get off my property before I have my men remove you." Grant gave a signal. The federal marshals spread out, surrounding the house. 20 armed lawmen against maybe 15 of Crow's hired guns. The numbers favored the law, but barely. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched so tight Clara thought it would snap. Then one of Crow's men made a mistake. He shifted his rifle, pointing it directly at Marshal Grant, and everything exploded into violence. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Clara's horse reared and she fought to control it, watching in horror as the careful arrest turned into a pitched battle. Men were shooting from windows, from behind walls, from any cover they could find. She saw one of the federal marshals go down, saw another clutch his shoulder, saw Crow disappear back into his house, leaving his men to fight while he fled. Marshal Grant was shouting orders, trying to restore control, but the chaos had taken over. This was exactly what Clara had feared, violence spinning out into more violence with no clear end. Then she saw Crow. He'd emerged from a side door and was running toward the stables, toward the horses that would let him escape. Clara didn't think. She kicked her horse into a gallop, racing across the open ground toward the stables. Behind her, someone was shouting her name, but she didn't stop. Crow reached the stable entrance and turned, seeing her bearing down on him. His face twisted with fury and something that might have been fear. He raised his pistol and fired. The bullet whined past Clara's ear so close she felt the heat of it. She yanked Maple's reins hard, sliding from the saddle as the mare turned, using the horse's body as cover. Another shot. This one hit dirt 3 feet from where Clara crouched. She pulled her rifle up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She'd never shot at a person before, never pointed a weapon at another human being with the intent to pull the trigger. But Crow was aiming again, and she saw her death in his eyes. Clara fired. The recoil slammed her shoulder back. The sound was deafening. She missed, the bullet hitting the stable wall behind Crow. He laughed, a sound without humor. Boston girl playing at being a frontier woman. You don't have what it takes to... She fired again. This time she didn't miss. The bullet took Crow in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his pistol, stumbled, caught himself against the stable wall. Blood spread across his expensive shirt like a blooming flower. Clara lowered her rifle, her whole body shaking. She'd shot him. Actually shot another human being. Federal marshals were running toward them now. Behind them, the gunfight was ending as Crow's men threw down their weapons and surrendered. Crow stared at Clara with hatred and disbelief. You shot me. You actually shot me. You were going to kill me. What did you expect? I expected you to run, to be too afraid to fight back. Clara walked closer, still holding her rifle, making sure Crow could see her face. Then you expected wrong. You thought I was just some Boston socialite playing at Frontier Life. But I'm Clara Mercer, and I fought for Red Hollow Valley, and I won. Marshal Grant reached them, his deputies pulling Crow to his feet despite his wounded shoulder. That was incredibly stupid and brave, Mrs. Mercer. Probably more stupid than brave. Maybe, but you stopped him from escaping. Grant snapped handcuffs on Crow's wrists. Silas Crow, you're under arrest. And this time, you're actually going to face justice. Crow's empire crumbled in the days that followed. Federal marshals seized his property as evidence. His hired guns scattered to the winds. The judges and officials he'd bought suddenly couldn't remember ever having met him. The investigation uncovered years of fraud, intimidation, and violence. Land illegally seized, families terrorized into selling at pennies on the dollar. Even 2 unsolved murders that now looked very much solved. Crow would spend the rest of his life in a territorial prison, if he was lucky. If the trial went badly, he'd hang. Clara and Elias returned to Red Hollow to find the ranch slowly returning to normal. Families were rebuilding their burned homes with help from neighbors. The grasslands would recover in time. The cattle that had scattered were gradually being rounded up. The valley had survived, scarred, damaged, but alive. Standing on the porch one evening as summer faded toward autumn, Clara thought about how much had changed since that first day when she'd stepped off the train expecting misery. She'd found something else instead. Purpose. Strength. Love that had been forged in fire and violence and refused to break. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. What are you thinking about? How different everything is from what I expected. Better or worse? Clara leaned back against him, watching the sun set over the valley they'd fought so hard to defend. Better, definitely better. Even with the violence and the fear and the nearly dying multiple times, even with all of that, because I'm alive here in a way I never was in Boston. I matter. What I do matters. You always mattered. Maybe, but I never felt it before. She turned in his arms to face him. This place changed me, made me into someone I'm actually proud to be. Elias kissed her forehead. The frontier didn't change you. It just gave you room to become who you were always meant to be. Maybe he was right. Maybe Clara had always had this strength inside her, just waiting for the right circumstances to bring it out. Or maybe the truth was simpler. Maybe people were capable of more than they imagined when they found something worth fighting for. Either way, Clara was home. Not in Boston with its safety and its suffocating expectations, but here, in the harsh and beautiful Wyoming territory, where she'd learned exactly how strong she could be. And she had no intention of ever leaving again. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains in mid-October with snow that transformed the scarred valley into something almost peaceful. Clara stood at the bedroom window watching the first real storm of the season, fat flakes falling thick and fast, covering the burned grasslands with white that made everything look clean and new. Behind her, Elias was building up the fire in the small stove they'd moved into the bedroom for warmth. The house was quieter now than it had been in months. Most of the refugee families had returned to their own ranches, rebuilding with the help of neighbors and the unexpected financial relief that had come when the territorial court seized Crow's assets and redistributed them to the families he'd victimized. It wasn't enough to erase the damage. Nothing could give back the months of fear or the homes that had burned. But it was something, a start. "You're thinking too hard again," Elias said, coming up behind her and resting his hands on her shoulders. "I can practically hear your mind working from across the room. I was thinking about Sarah Morrison. She told me yesterday that they're planning to rebuild their house in the spring, but she's having nightmares every night. Can't sleep without a lamp burning. Her children won't go outside after dark. That'll take time to heal. Trauma doesn't disappear just because the danger's gone." Clara turned to face him. "Do you have nightmares about the fire or the fighting or any of it?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. I dream that I'm riding back to the ranch and you're gone. That Crow got to you while I was fighting the fire and I couldn't protect you. That I come home to an empty house and realize I lost the most important thing without even knowing it." The honesty in his voice made Clara's throat tight. They'd gotten better at this over the months, talking about the hard things, admitting fear and vulnerability instead of pretending everything was fine. "I'm still here," she said. "We both are. We survived. Barely. And I keep thinking about how close we came to losing everything. But we didn't. That has to count for something." Elias pulled her close, and they stood watching the snow fall in silence. Clara had learned that some moments didn't need words. Sometimes it was enough just to be together, alive and safe, in a house that had withstood everything the frontier had thrown at it. Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway, her expression caught between amusement and exasperation. "If you two are done being romantic, there's someone here to see you," says she came all the way from Boston. Clara's heart stuttered. "From Boston?" That's what she said. Older woman, well-dressed, looks like she's not entirely sure how she ended up in Wyoming territory. Clara was down the stairs before Mrs. Brennan finished speaking, Elias following close behind. In the main hall, standing near the fireplace and looking thoroughly out of place in her expensive traveling clothes, was Margaret Whitmore, Clara's mother. They stared at each other across the room. Clara hadn't seen her mother in over 2 years, not since the day her father had decided Clara was too stubborn to be marriageable and started making arrangements to ship her west. Margaret had stood silently during that final argument, not defending her daughter, but not condemning her either, just watching with sad eyes while her husband destroyed their family. "Mother," Clara said, her voice catching on the word. "Clara." Margaret took a hesitant step forward. "You look so different, stronger somehow, or maybe just older. It's been 2 years. People change in 2 years." "Yes, they do." Margaret's eyes swept the room, taking in the rough furniture and stone walls and everything that was so completely different from their Boston townhouse. "Your letter said you'd found a life here. I wanted to see for myself." The letter. Clara had written it months ago, during one of the long nights when the future had seemed uncertain, and she'd felt the need to tell someone, anyone, what she'd built in this harsh place. She hadn't expected a response, much less a visit. Elias cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Elias Mercer, Clara's husband." Margaret studied him with the same assessing gaze Clara remembered from her childhood, the look that could spot a lie or a weakness at 50 paces. "Mr. Mercer, my husband told me you were a frontier rancher of no particular breeding or prospects. He failed to mention you were also apparently capable of defending a ranch against overwhelming odds and building something worth fighting for. Your husband didn't know me very well. No, he rarely knows anyone very well. It's one of his many failings." Margaret turned back to Clara. May we speak privately?" Clara led her mother upstairs to the bedroom, acutely aware of how small and rough it must seem to a woman used to Boston luxury. But if Margaret was judging, she kept it to herself. "I left him," Margaret said without preamble once the door was closed. "Your father, 3 weeks ago, packed my belongings and walked out of that house with no intention of ever returning." Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, stunned. "Why?" "Because I spent 25 years watching him destroy everything good in his life through sheer arrogance and cruelty. I watched him drive you away. I watched him alienate his business partners, his friends, what little family he had left. And I realized I was next, that he would eventually turn that same cruelty on me, and I would either break under it or become someone I didn't recognize." "So you just left?" "I just left. Filed for legal separation, took what money was rightfully mine from the marriage, and booked passage west to see the daughter who'd been brave enough to do what I never could." Clara felt tears pricking her eyes. "You could have defended me. That last day when he was sending me away, you could have said something." "I know, and I regret that more than you can imagine. But I was a coward, Clara. I'd spent so long being the obedient wife that I'd forgotten how to be anything else." Margaret sat down beside her on the bed. "Your letter changed that. Reading about everything you'd done, how you'd fought and survived and built a life on your own terms. It made me realize that if my daughter could be that brave, maybe I could find some courage too. I wasn't brave. I was terrified most of the time." "Being terrified and doing it anyway is the definition of bravery." They sat in silence for a moment. Clara thought about all the years of resentment she'd carried, all the anger at her mother's silence and complicity in her father's cruelty. And she realized that holding on to that anger wouldn't change the past. It would just poison whatever future they might build together. "How long are you staying?" Clara asked. "That depends. Your letter mentioned the valley was recovering, that there might be opportunities for people willing to work hard and start over. I was thinking I might see if there's a place for me here." "You want to stay in Wyoming territory?" "I want to be somewhere I matter, somewhere I can make my own choices and live with the consequences. You found that here. Maybe I can too." Clara looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw something she'd never noticed before. The tiredness in Margaret's eyes, the way she held herself like she was still bracing for criticism or contempt. Her mother had been as trapped as Clara had been, just in a different kind of cage. "There's a teaching position open in town," Clara said slowly. "The previous teacher left last month. It doesn't pay much, but the territorial government provides housing, and the valley needs someone who can teach more than just basic reading and arithmetic." Margaret's expression brightened. "I was an excellent student before I married. Languages, mathematics, literature. Your father thought education was wasted on women, but I never stopped reading." "Then maybe you should talk to the town council. I know a few of them. I could make introductions." "You do that? After everything?" Clara thought about it. "You're here now. That's what matters. The rest, we'll figure out as we go." They went downstairs together to find Elias in the office, working through the endless paperwork that running a ranch required. He looked up when they entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore is thinking about staying in the area," Clara said. "There's a teaching position in Red Hollow that might suit her." Elias glanced between them, reading the situation with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to spot trouble before it fully developed. "Is that right?" "Well, the valley could use a good teacher. Most of the children barely know their letters." "I'd like to help if I can," Margaret said. "And I'd like to get to know my daughter again. Really know her, not just the version her father allowed me to see." "That'll take some time," Clara said honestly. "We've both got years of damage to work through, but I'm willing to try if you are." Margaret reached out and took Clara's hand. "I'm willing." Over the following weeks, Margaret settled into Red Hollow with a determination that surprised everyone. She met with the town council, demonstrated her teaching credentials, and was hired on the spot. The schoolhouse had been empty for months, and parents were desperate for someone qualified to educate their children. Clara watched her mother transform from the quiet, subservient woman she remembered into someone focused and purposeful. Margaret threw herself into teaching with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. She organized the school, developed curriculum, and within a month had 23 students of various ages learning everything from basic arithmetic to Latin. "Your mother is terrifying," Tommy said one afternoon, returning from town with supplies. "She made me conjugate verbs just for bringing the mail. I'm 24 years old and she had me feeling like a schoolboy who didn't do his homework." Clara laughed. She was always like that, just never had an outlet for it before. The valley continued its slow recovery. Winter was hard, supplies ran low, temperatures dropped to brutal levels, and there were days when Clara wondered if they'd all made a terrible mistake trying to rebuild in such an unforgiving place. But spring came, as it always did. The snow melted into rushing creeks. Grass began growing over the burned land. Cattle that had survived the winter gave birth to new calves. Life continued its stubborn march forward despite everything. Clara found she was pregnant in March. Mrs. Brennan noticed first, seeing the signs Clara had been too busy to recognize. "You're carrying," the older woman said matter-of-factly one morning when Clara had been too nauseous to eat breakfast. "About 2 months along, I'd guess." "I can't be pregnant. We've been too busy for—" Clara stopped, thinking about the nights after the danger had passed, when she and Elias had turned to each other for comfort and connection. Oh, indeed. Does Elias know?" "Not yet. I didn't know until 30 seconds ago." "Well, you'd better tell him before I do. Men get funny about these things if they're not informed properly." Clara found Elias in the barn, working on repairing a stall that had been damaged during the winter. He was stripped to the waist despite the cool spring air, sweat running down his back while he hammered boards into place. "We need to talk," Clara said. He looked up immediately, reading the seriousness in her voice. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think it is. But I'm pregnant." Elias dropped the hammer. It hit the dirt floor with a dull thud. "You're... what?" "Pregnant. Mrs. Brennan says about 2 months along." He just stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, fear, and finally settling on something that looked like wonder. "We're having a baby, apparently, though I have to say the timing could be better. We're still rebuilding, money's tight, and I have no idea how to be a mother." Elias crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully like she might break. "We'll figure it out. Same way we've figured out everything else. By making it up as we go and hoping we don't completely mess it up?" "Exactly." He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you scared?" "Terrified, but also—" Clara searched for the right words. "Also kind of excited. We're building something that lasts. Not just a ranch, but a family. A future. That's what I always wanted. When I was 17 and took over this place after my parents died, I had this vision of what it could become. Not just land and cattle, but a real home. A legacy. I just never thought I'd find someone who wanted to build that with me." Clara thought about the girl she'd been 2 years ago, stepping off that train and expecting misery. She'd been so convinced her life was over that she was being sold into frontier servitude with no hope of happiness or purpose. How wrong she'd been. The baby was born in November, during the first snowstorm of the season. It was a difficult birth. Mrs. Brennan and Margaret both attended, while Elias paced downstairs and wore a path in the floor with his nervous walking. But when Clara finally heard her daughter's first cry, strong and indignant at being pulled from warmth into cold, she felt something shift in her chest. A fierce, protective love unlike anything she'd experienced before. "She's perfect," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped the baby in clean blankets. "Absolutely perfect." They named her Sarah, after Sarah Morrison, whose family had lost everything but found the courage to rebuild. It seemed fitting somehow, giving their daughter a name that meant strength in the face of loss. Elias held his daughter with the careful terror of someone handling something infinitely precious and breakable. "She's so small. She'll grow. They do that." Clara felt exhaustion pulling at her, but she couldn't stop looking at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. "We made a person, Elias. An actual human being who's going to grow up and have thoughts and opinions and probably give us endless grief. Just like her mother. Hopefully with better judgment about which battles are worth fighting. Where would be the fun in that?" Over the following months, Red Hollow settled into a new kind of rhythm. The ranch had survived its trials and emerged stronger, though scarred. The Water Alliance continued to function, protecting the small ranchers from anyone who might try to follow in Crow's footsteps. The valley had attracted new settlers, people who'd heard about the community that had stood up to a tyrant and wanted to be part of something similar. Margaret thrived in her teaching role, educating a generation of frontier children who would grow up literate and informed. She and Clara gradually rebuilt their relationship, though it would never be entirely free of the damage the past had caused. Some wounds healed with time, others just taught you how to live with the scars. Sarah Morrison's children slowly recovered from their trauma. Thomas Henderson regained most of his strength, though his lungs would wheeze for the rest of his life. The Morrison house was rebuilt, better than before, with stone walls that wouldn't burn and a root cellar that could shelter the whole family. And Clara learned that motherhood was simultaneously the hardest and most rewarding thing she'd ever attempted. Baby Sarah was demanding, opinionated, and stubborn, traits she'd clearly inherited from both parents. But watching her daughter discover the world, seeing everything through new eyes, gave Clara a perspective she'd never had before. This was what they'd fought for. Not just land or water rights or victory over an enemy, but the right to build lives and raise families and create futures in this harsh, beautiful place. One evening in late spring, Clara stood on the porch with Sarah bundled in her arms, watching the sun set over the valley. Elias came up beside her, his arms settling around her shoulders in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Staying here instead of going back to Boston? All the danger and fear and nearly dying multiple times?" Clara thought about the question seriously. "No, because going back would have meant being safe but meaningless. Here, I matter. What I do makes a difference. I'm building something that will outlast me. We're building it together." "Yes, we are." She looked up at him. "I was thinking about what Mrs. Patterson told me on the train that first day. She said the frontier breaks some women, but makes others stronger than they imagined. I didn't understand it then. And now? Now, I think she was only half right. The frontier doesn't make you strong. It just reveals the strength that was always there, waiting for circumstances hard enough to force it to the surface. I wasn't weak in Boston. I was just never given the chance to discover what I was capable of." Elias kissed her forehead. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you got that chance, even if it nearly killed both of us several times. Romance on the frontier," Clara said dryly, "just like the dime novels promised." They stood together as darkness settled over Red Hollow Ranch, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. Baby Sarah made a small sound in her sleep, and Clara adjusted the blanket to keep her warm. This was home now. Not the Boston of her childhood with its safety and suffocating expectations, but this rough place where survival demanded everything you had and rewarded you with purpose and meaning in return. Clara had come to the frontier believing she'd been sold into captivity. Instead, she'd found freedom. The freedom to be strong when strength was required. The freedom to fight when fighting was necessary. The freedom to build a life on her own terms, with a man who respected her mind as much as he loved her heart. The frontier hadn't destroyed her. It had forged her into someone capable of defending what mattered, of standing up to power without flinching, of creating something beautiful and lasting in a place that tried to break everyone who challenged it. And standing on that porch with her family, looking out at the valley they'd fought so hard to protect, Clara understood something fundamental about life that Boston had never taught her. Safety wasn't the same as strength. Comfort wasn't the same as purpose. And sometimes the hardest roads led to the most meaningful destinations. She'd been 20 years old when she stepped off that train, frightened and resentful, and convinced her life was over. Now, at 23, she was a rancher's wife, a mother, a business partner, and a woman who'd stared down tyranny and refused to blink. The frontier had given her that, not easily, not without cost, but completely. And she would spend the rest of her life grateful for it. Years later, when Sarah was old enough to ask questions, Clara would tell her daughter the story of Red Hollow Valley, about the land baron who tried to steal everything, about the alliance of small ranchers who refused to be broken, about the Boston girl who came west expecting misery and found herself instead. She would tell Sarah about the night they stood together against impossible odds, about the fire that tried to consume them, about the strength it took to rebuild after everything had burned. But most importantly, she would tell her daughter this, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. That strength wasn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every single time. That the person you became was shaped more by how you responded to hardship than by any blessing you might receive. These were the lessons the frontier had taught Clara, and they were the legacy she would pass on to her daughter and her daughter's children and every generation that came after. Because Red Hollow Ranch wasn't just land and buildings and cattle. It was a testament to what people could build when they refused to accept defeat, when they stood together against injustice, when they chose to fight for something bigger than themselves. That was worth any cost, worth the fear and the danger and the sleepless nights and the moments when everything seemed lost. And standing on that porch with the people she loved, watching the stars emerge over the valley that had become her home, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. She'd stayed when she could have run, fought when she could have surrendered, built when destruction seemed inevitable. And in doing so, she'd discovered exactly who she was meant to be. Not someone's decorative daughter or obedient wife, but Clara Mercer, frontier woman, defender of Red Hollow Valley, mother to the next generation who would inherit the world she and Elias had fought to protect. The frontier had forged her into someone unstoppable, and she had absolutely no regrets.